Hello and welcome to a bonus Raw Sports show that is designed to preview the 2021 F1 season that starts in a matter of days, really. We're pre-recording this on Wednesday. Hopefully you'll see this on Thursday, so you'll have 1 or 2 days to get through and watch this before the racing action kicks off in Bahrain. I am your host, your head of sport, Josh Sim. Thank you for watching or listening if you're on the podcast feed, because we're going to put this one on there. And so we've got a strong lineup of F1 experts, fans, aficionados, all here. We're going to go through all 10 teams. We're going to cover, we're going to look at the calendar. We won't cover every single track, but we'll cover some of the highlights that we sort of anticipate, as well as looking at the Bahrain Grand Prix more specifically at the end. So all that to look forward to. If you haven't seen anything from us, feel free to like and subscribe. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. In the video description, obviously, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all that good stuff. If you're a Warwick student, you can obviously join the Facebook group as well. And yes, we will also have in the video description ourselves and Ball Sport are co-running a F1 Fantasy League, and in the video description there should be a link to join said league. If you want to give F1 Fantasy a go, whether you're a fan of fantasy sports or whether you're a casual fan of F1 and you want to find another avenue for that passion. So all that to there. Also, I should mention that in term 3, we're going to be looking for new roles head of sports, as I am currently in the role as caretaker, and I'm trying to think of a famous F1 caretaker boss. Someone of our panelists will let me know who it is. Sort of, I guess, the Nico Hulkenberg of Raw Sport at the moment. I'll go with that one. So if you are, if you have a passion for sport, if you, want to lead our coverage for, namely the big ones being the Euros, the summer, the Olympics, and, the rest of the sport from now to March next year, you can. If you just follow, join the sports group on Facebook if you can. Or send me a message if you have any interest in running, because it is a really great role and you get to do stuff like this. It's not as scary as it appears to be. You get used to it, and it's an exciting year for sport, at least. So if running for head of sport is something that you're interested in, please consider it and keep an eye out for that by-election, which I think will happen at some point in early term 3. We don't have exact dates, but yes. So that's my plug for the head of sport role. Right, let's bring on our numerous guests. We'll start with, we have a special guest, someone who we haven't had on before, someone from the newly created, it's been a few months maybe, but certainly one of the newest societies at Warwick University, the F1 Society. Tom joins me now. How are you?
Hello, I'm well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. So for those who don't, because this is, as I sort of preface there, it's a newly created society, the F1 Society. Do you want to just explain it a little bit and tell people where they can join or find you guys?
Yeah, no problem. So as you said, the Warwick F1 Society was created early December, but officially the SU has recognised us about a month ago. And so to find us, you can follow the find Warwick F1 Soc on either Facebook or Instagram mostly. And our aim is to bring about a whole F1 community interested in F1, so we can follow races together, but also hopefully in the future get people from the F1 industry on to talk about what job they do and what possible careers people could have within the sport. So yes, it's all quite exciting. It's all new, and so hopefully next year we'll start off with a bang.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure if I haven't said this to you, then I'm sure at least while I'm in charge of Raw Sport, very happy to collaborate, and I'm sure whoever comes after me will be very happy to collaborate as well. So it's exciting times, and I know, having been in the WhatsApp group at the moment for the society, there's a lot of you guys have mobilized a lot of people quite quickly, so that's definitely exciting. And for those who don't know you, what is, just briefly, can you explain how you got into following F1, and then maybe say your favorite driver or track or team or anything like that?
Yeah, so I got into F1 while I was still quite a young kid. I used to watch the F1 races at home, and so I'm a big Jenson Button fan at first, and that's how I kind of followed him and kind of like got to watch the sport of F1 on a regular basis. And now, obviously, Button's retired. He's been retired for 4 years now, I believe. So my favorite driver now is Daniel Ricciardo. Favorite team is any team Daniel Ricciardo's in. So right now it's McLaren. And so, yeah, I'm really looking forward to this season. I think a lot of potential is there.
You and I are going to get along so well. As an Australian, Daniel Ricciardo is like the North Star of all things Formula One. So that's amazing. It's not, we'll start bringing on the other people we've got, beginning with Joe Spagnoli. Joe, you have Italian heritage. Do you want to explain? Is an Italian team your favorite? And if not, name that team and also drivers. Let's hear them.
An Italian team is my favorite, having grown up. I think my first experience of Formula One, there's an old VHS tape somewhere of me watching a battle between, I think it was the Spa battle between Hakkinen and Schumacher back in 1999. So this kid started early. Having watched Minardi struggle and flounder at the back, I'm now a fan of Alpha-Tauri, formerly Toro Rosso, formerly Minardi. But my favorite driver, following on from the narrative of the last couple of years, someone who was treated so badly by Red Bull, I'm a huge Pierre Gasly fan, just ahead of Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc.
Yeah, I dare say there's an exciting crop of young drivers coming through. Just briefly, I mentioned the F1 Fantasy League. I know you and I offline have had discussions without revealing to each other who we've picked. We've had sort of vague discussions. How have you solidified your lineup, or are you still tinkering with the choices?
I think, there is one choice between two drivers towards the back of the field that I'm still undecided about. I'm going to have a look at it in the next couple of days. Other than that, though, my mostly Franco-Monegasque team, which basically describes all the drivers I have, it's mostly finished.
Okay. Just briefly, did testing help that choice or make it harder for you?
No, testing was, the teams that let me down in testing were not represented in my fantasy team. Okay. So no change.
Cool. There we go. So he doesn't have Mercedes. That's an exclusive. Let's bring on, we've also got the newly elected Raw head of news and a regular to our Raw Sports show. So I hope he's able to join our Raw Sports shows every now and then. Cam Hall, hello.
Hi, it's fantastic to be here. I see now Raw Sports kind of like my kind of respite from a day job almost, which is, I really like it.
Yeah, we definitely talk the less serious, or at least we try to treat it as the less serious. Again, as I sort of talked about with the other guys, what's sort of your favorite driver team at the moment in Formula One, and what I guess generally just excites you about the sport?
Well, my favorite driver, I guess it was kind of Lewis Hamilton. I got into Formula One watching Lewis Hamilton as a wee kind of 6-7-year-old, and I've been following him 10, 15 years now. And not even then, back in 2007, 2008, could I have imagined Lewis Hamilton would become the 7-time world champion that he is. But he's just a phenomenal driver that time and time again, you think that you've reached the limit of what Lewis Hamilton can do. And then he just goes above and beyond what you can imagine he does. And not just what he does, I think, on the track, but kind of the profile he's built for himself off the track as well. I think it's done Formula One a lot of good. And so I'm certainly a huge Lewis Hamilton fan in that regard. And team-wise, again, maybe this goes back to me liking McLaren back in 2007, 2008 when Lewis was driving for them. But I have always had a bit of a soft spot for them. I don't know, obviously seeing them struggle in the last few years and obviously seeing the Mercedes dominance, I know whether that just drew me into them even more, but I like this current McLaren team. There's a much more of a kind of a positive atmosphere there now. I think one that is certainly, I think we've talked about, I think Ron Dennis before, kind of comparing him to kind of the stereotypical Bond villain. And I think McLaren have really started to kind of move away from that now. And it's a much, I'd say more, not necessarily family friendly, but certainly a much more engaging team as well to follow. And I really like to see their progress. And I do hope they do well this season.
First time of the new season, you're muted, Josh.
Gosh sake, I did it. You know what it was? It wasn't actually muted on the StreamYard. It was muted on the mic, so that's annoying. But there we go. It always, for those who don't watch our stuff, this always happens, so it's not a surprise. Let's finally bring on the former editor of the sports section of the War. Luke James is here with us. There he is. Luke, how are you?
I'm good. Looking forward to a new season of F1. Lots to discuss.
And any driver team that you sort of prefer over the others?
To give you kind of brief context, so when I started watching F1 with my dad, it was all about Michael Schumacher. I had various Ferrari bears kind of named after Michael Schumacher. After that, I became very much obsessed with Felipe Massa and was devastated when he didn't win that World Championship to Lewis Hamilton. So to cut a long story short, very, very excited for Mick Schumacher this year. That's kind of what I'm watching out for right at the back of the grid.
There we go. So how this show works, and those listening on podcast feed, you're not going to see this. You're not going to see the visual hijinks that happens, but we are going to have two people at a time sort of talking about each team, just because in the interest of time, we don't really want to make this a 3-hour epic or a 4-hour Justice League Snyder cut. We're trying to keep this 2 hours at least. Joe, don't give me that face. We really can't do a 4-hour cut here. You're muted. So joke's on you this time. So we're going to do 2 by 2 at least, or at least try to. Maybe for some of the more for teams like, say, Mercedes, where there's a lot of buzz of whether this could be, you know, the end of their reign at the top or whatever, we'll bring on everyone because that's sort of a bigger topic. But that's generally how it's going to work. So yeah, please don't be confused if you only hear 2 voices, then we sort of move on. That's just gonna how we're gonna do it. And how we're gonna go through, and I'm gonna bring everyone off because I'm gonna explain how we're gonna go through these teams is, for full context, I asked all the panelists to rank the 2021 car designs deliveries from just top to bottom. What do they like? And rather than go through each team based on their championship standing last season or their popularity, we've decided we're going to go in order of how the panelists viewed their car design / liveries from bottom to top. So we're going to start with the one that collectively they thought was the least impressive to the most impressive. And that will be sort of the Raw Sports official power rankings, preseason power rankings, car design rankings, whatever you want to call it. That's how this is going to go. So for full disclosure, they don't know which team, how the team's ranked either. So this is going to be a surprise for them and whoever comes on. So at number 10, and this is a dream because this is now like a chart show, and sports don't usually get to do chart shows. So at 10, we have Ferrari came in a clear bottom of the car design ranking. Who am I going to bring on? Well, I have everyone's rankings, so I'm able to see, but almost everyone had Ferrari bottom, except for Tom, who we're going to bring on. You had Ferrari second bottom, so it's not like a big difference. And then we'll bring Joe on for your Italian stylings. So, Joe, I'll start with you. Why Ferrari bottom?
Because it's absolutely clapped. The biggest problem for me isn't the green Mission Winnow sponsor, partly because it's not the worst aspect of the car, but secondly because on a lot of European tracks especially, we probably won't be seeing that on the car because cigarette advertising is illegal. The biggest problem with it is the fade to burgundy at the back. The one-off livery they had at Mugello last year is kind of similar to that color. The transition to it, whether you do it roughly or smoothly, just looks absolutely hideous. The font for the driver numbers, I know it's a really, really specific point to make. that's hideous, just like it was last year. I mean, there's not much more I can say, Josh. We all put it damn near the bottom. For me, only Williams comes close to how bad it looks. They are the only two bad liveries in Formula One this year. And to be honest, going out of pre-season, I don't have a huge amount of faith in Ferrari, despite the fact on paper, I think they've probably got the best driver lineup on the grid this year.
Yeah, and Thomas, I mean, you also had this, if not bottom, second bottom, as I just said. I mean, yeah, same question really. What is it about this car that just feels like a step back? Does it feel like a step back from last season's? What are your thoughts on the car?
Yeah, so for me, it's definitely a step back. I mean, Ferrari did tease like their two red colours. And so I was a big fan personally of the Mugello livery last year. So I was kind of hoping that if it was burgundy, it would be well integrated. But as Joe said, it just wasn't, like, not at all. The back just doesn't work for me. Sadly, they should have kept it. The normal Ferrari red we've come to get used to these past few seasons. And I'm definitely not a fan of the Mission Winnow green. I see where they're coming from with trying to replicate the Italian green, white and red pattern, but it just hasn't worked out for them. And it's, for me, it's there's too much mixing for me, and it just doesn't work. The end product is really bad.
Yeah, they've really given this one a go. Maybe because they maybe try to experiment before the big changes, technical changes come into the sport, and so tried to finish with a flourish, and they've ended up with egg on their face. But Ferrari, let's talk about their preseason testing. Joe, what did you make of their testing? And I mean, did it stand out to you? Does it signify that they're going to make any steps forward, or are you still concerned with them going forward?
The real concern with Ferrari was that obviously in the wake of the FIA coming down on their most likely illegal engine from 2019 is that they had by far the worst power unit last year. And there's been a massive discussion off track, obviously, because of the Honda situation pulling out of the sport at the end of this year, discussions over the freeze on engine developments, which Ferrari do not want to be brought forward because, my God, they need to develop the hell out of the problem they found themselves in, which is entirely of their own making. I was hoping after pre-season testing that we'd know just how much closer the Ferrari power unit was to the others. Truth is, we still don't really know. A lot of the Ferrari shod cars, especially the Alfa Romeo, showed great reliability. But in terms of the actual Ferrari, we didn't see a huge amount. It looks like, I think a lot of us are going to be predicting them 4th or 5th in the championship this year. An improvement, but really a modest one, not what Mattia Binotto is going to have hoped for. The real question going into this year, though, is what a lot of coverage has been about, which is the sheer quality of their driver lineup. And will Carlos Sainz, as second driver, unofficially, be a little bit too good for a second driver and put the heat on Charles Leclerc, who is basically the golden child, as he should be? There's a real risk, despite the fact that these are two very calm drivers, that we could see a repeat of the Vettel-Leclerc problems of a couple of years ago. But yeah, Mattia Binotto is going to have one hell of a good season if he sees this out. He's very lucky to still be in that job because Ferrari do not like disappointing in this sport, and last year just was not good enough.
Yeah, and Thomas, Ferrari, last year they were in the mid-table. That wasn't where they want to be. They obviously want to be challenging at the top, and the hope is this season they can actually separate themselves from the likes of Alpha-Tauri and Aston Martin and maybe push towards Mercedes, Red Bull. How likely, in your eyes, is this to happen? And also, how likely do you think that they're going to, really establish themselves as maybe a top 3 sort of level team?
Yeah, I think after the terrible season of last year, I think it was the worst season in 40 years. It's important to stay realistic. I don't think Ferrari will ever be competing with the likes of Red Bull and Mercedes. And so I think it's more of a transition year. And I feel like Ferrari should be looking at 2022 to make the biggest impact possible. As for how their testing went, it was quite uneventful. the race simulations didn't go too badly for them. I wouldn't say they have the best power unit, certainly not, but they don't have the worst reliability either. And I think the drag problems they had last year are much less apparent this year on this new car. And so I have hope that they'll be able to go to the top of the midfield this year, but nothing more than that, sadly. And as Joe said, Binotto needs at least a 4th to 5th place finish to have the hope to keep his job coming into 2022 and the new regulations.
Yeah, and a lot of, as you guys sort of alluded to, a lot of pressure on the team, on the top brass, would you say, of the team. And as Joe alluded to, there has been a change to the driver lineup. Out goes Sebastian Vettel, who is now at Aston Martin, which we'll talk about in a second. But in comes Carlos Sainz, who had a pretty strong season at McLaren. I don't think it was sort of an even battle between him and Lando Norris per se, but now he's at Ferrari. Joe, why? Go.
I'm sorry,
why?
look, this is not me trashing every aspect of to come from the UK, like it sounds like I always do on sports shows.
Okay.
Sainz hammered Norris both of these last 2 seasons. Even when Sainz was getting consistently unlucky at the beginning of last year, pace-wise, he was so much more impressive. Norris began the season amazingly. The second Grand Prix in Austria in particular, where he finished 5th, he was even better than when he got the podium the week before. But Sainz Norris had a great season. Sainz had an unbelievable season. It's just a shame that he's going to easily the most toxic team on the grid.
Yeah, I guess that's my next. To play off that, I guess that's my next question, Joe. Do you feel like this is a step forward or a step back for Carlos Sainz? Assuming Ferrari's performance last year and assuming that they don't develop their way out of this hole, this is the number one reason why you do not sign a contract before the season starts. Last year, he signed that contract before the Austrian Grand Prix to move to Ferrari in what was actually a pretty positive shift. There didn't seem to be much acrimony between McLaren and Ferrari, especially like there used to be 10 years ago. But at some races, I think it was Spa in particular, which is probably the worst Grand Prix Ferrari had last year. As Thomas alluded to, the drag problem really hurt them going down the Camel Straight. But Sainz's McLaren could not start the race. There was a technical problem and he was just sat on the pit wall and he looked so depressed throughout the race, which is very unusual for Carlos Sainz. And the theory was that he was just looking at this Ferrari thinking, what the hell have I signed up for next year? First of all, you're no longer a de facto first or equal driver with Lando Norris. You're going to be treated as a second behind Charles Leclerc, the Academy golden boy. And then you've got a car with a worse power unit, worse aero, probably worse chassis as well. Yeah, he's going to... I'm glad that he got a lot of mileage in testing, and people like myself, Drive to Survive fans, analysts over at the race and similar, rate Carlos Sainz very highly. He was my driver of the year for 2019, and he was definitely top 3 last year for me, obliterated Lando Norris in my opinion. But look, he's coming up against Charles Leclerc, who was my driver of the season last year, and he's going to be used to how difficult that Ferrari was to drive last year. This is a huge change for Sainz, and I know he's moved around the field an awful lot, but this may be one change too much. And Josh has disappeared. So Cam, if you're there, please bring people onto the screen. Grazie.
Okay, so yes, Josh has, as you can see, has left. But I guess owing to my new job, I guess for now I have the rights. And I saw Josh pop up, and now he's gone again. So I guess let's round the conversation off on Ferrari before I guess we move on to the next team, which I saw popped up on the screen. So we'll let Josh know when he gets back. But Luke, I guess now you've joined us on the stream. What do you think of Ferrari's hopes for this season? I think the panel has certainly said so far, this is certainly after a very difficult 2020 by, I think, the most conservative of estimates. Is this very much just a season of building towards 2022, or can Ferrari make substantive steps forward this season?
I think realistically, you've got to expect more of the same simply because of the limited number of changes they could make between kind of last season and this one. So I think you'd have to be wearing very heavily kind of red tinted glasses to expect them to be challenging towards the front. So yeah, I think they can't get worse, can they? You'd hope not. I think the driver lineup has improved, looking on recent form. So I think they've got to get better. I think how substantial that change is remains to be seen. So yeah, I'm expecting another really tough season for Ferrari, albeit one that might not be quite as bad as last time out.
I think we'll be waiting clearly to see what happens in Bahrain, what happens in qualifying, whether perhaps if Ferrari can get into the top 10, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Ferrari. Let's move on to another team now, a team, I guess, very intimately linked to Ferrari, but Haas. Let's talk about Haas next, because I saw from Josh, this was the livery that was ranked 9th. Hopefully we'll get a view of that livery very soon. But I guess the first point to make from that Haas livery for the American team in Formula One, it had a surprisingly Russian flavour about it, didn't it, Joe?
A surprisingly Russian flavour, which may well be ruled illegal in the coming days by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Just a TLDR on it, after the doping scandal that affected a huge amount of Russian athletes. Russian athletes are not allowed to use the Russian flag, so Mazepin, their new driver, is going to have to use a neutral flag, as he did in Formula 2 last year, I believe. And you're not allowed to display the Russian flag on like racing overalls or the livery. Haas's defense is that the red, white and blue are just the colors of the flag, as indeed they are for a lot of flags, not least the United States. However, the positioning of it, the ordering of it makes it pretty damn clear that it's a Russian flag. Not to mention the fact that Nikita Mazepin's father's company, Uralkali, is plastered all over the car. Before we go on to someone else, I actually had this livery ranked in the top half. I think it's clean. I think it's nice. Personally, I would much rather have Uralkali over my car than Aramco all over my track. That's a discussion for another day. But yeah, aside from that, I think it's going to be a pretty difficult season for Haas, as we're going to discuss very soon.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's an interesting one because obviously Haas and sponsorship and money, this has been something that has been a real talking point. And indeed, if you watch, I think it's episode 7 of Drive to Survive, the whole kind of background of that is Günther Steiner working with Gene Haas to try and bring sponsors into the team, to try and bring some much needed cash. Thomas, I guess obviously we saw from that episode there's a real push to bring the money in. And I guess let's start talking about Nikita Mazepin. Nikita Mazepin is very much seen as a pay driver, well, arguably regarded as a pay driver, of course, someone who has had success in the junior formula. But how do you see him obviously fitting in with this team? Do you think are we expecting much from Nikita Mazepin?
Yeah, well, I believe obviously not talking about all his off-track scandals. I believe in Formula 2, even though he didn't finish right at the top, I still think he showed flashes of greatness. And obviously his aggressive driving style that we saw in F2 will hope to see much less of it, seeing as though Haas I don't see being anywhere near the top of the grid and nowhere near trying to overtake people. But Nikita Mazepin, if we compare to Mick Schumacher, I believe stands a good chance. Obviously, both of them are new to the team. They need to get to know the environment, but that's something that Mazepin was somehow able to do last year. So I think that it will be quite a close battle between him and Schumacher, obviously at the back of the grid. Obviously, we're not looking at points finishes, but it will be interesting who finishes out on top, not only in qualifying, but also during the race, because I believe that in race trim, Nikita Mazepin has these sparks and can challenge his teammate every 2 weeks.
Well, let's move on from Nikita Mazepin to Mick Schumacher. Obviously, Luke, you mentioned you're a fan of the Schumacher dynasty. You grew up watching Michael Schumacher. We've now got his eldest son, Mick, racing in Formula One. I guess, how excited are you about him coming into Formula One, racing for Haas, and how do you think he's going to fare this season?
I mean, it is just really exciting, isn't it? I think it's always good to see kind of rookie drivers come into the sport, and I think this is obviously one that has a lot of anticipation around it. He did a really interesting interview with the BBC the other day with Dan Rowan, just talking about kind of how he was handling the pressure and what it was like to be in the situation that he's now currently in. I've got to be honest, I expect him to have a better season than Mazepin, and there's two reasons for that. One is the history. So the F2 standings last year, kind of Schumacher ended on 215 points, the Mazepin's 164. The other difference, I think, overwhelmingly, and this could just be a social media bubble thing, but I also think it kind of bleeds into the track itself as well, is that the narrative surrounding both drivers and the atmosphere surrounding both drivers is very, very different. I think Schumacher comes into the sport with kind of a lot of goodwill already in the bank, whereas Mazepin has to perform from the get-go, otherwise he's going to have even more people kind of on his back. So yeah, I think in terms of the environment that they've created for each of the drivers, Schumacher has a much easier start to life in F1. I think Mazepin faces a real uphill battle and he'll need to start well in Bahrain. It's going to be really interesting though. I think, as you say, it's going to be at the back of the grid. It's not going to be kind of looking at points. So it's a tricky one. I think the question as well to look at is a couple of times last year, Haas used a fairly different system in safety car environments. So then is there an opportunity to see kind of more of the same in that kind of scenario and see how both drivers can cope with the pressure kind of further up the field if they were to try and undercut people that way. So yeah, there's lots of different scenarios where this could be interesting. I think my gut feel is that Schumacher is set up for a better season. It's just to see whether or not he delivers on that.
Just before we go back to Josh, because Josh just now rejoined the stream. Joe, I know you had a point to make on both of the drivers.
Yeah, it's a really interesting driver lineup. And first of all, on Schumacher, I don't have a huge amount of hope for him going into this season for two reasons. Number one, Haas are, for me, shaping up to be by far the weakest team in the grid, Ferrari power unit improvement or not. And Schumacher has historically shown in at least his first season of junior Formula categories, both in Formula 3 and Formula 2, that he's not really a first season bloomer. He tends to bloom in his second season, especially later on. So we need to give him time. With the Haas being, if it's anything like last year's car, incredibly difficult to drive, I think this could be the worst possible team for him to go straight until Ferrari links or not. I really would rather he'd driven for Alfa-Romeo this year. But of course, Raikkonen stuck around, so we know why that happened. Nonetheless, it is fantastic to have his name back in the sport, and I'm hoping he does well. As for Nikita Mazepin, I'm not going to go into the social media controversy because we've discussed that in the past with the shows from last year. What I've tried to do is not defend Mazepin, but play devil's advocate a little bit. And he did an interview with Will Buxton, Formula One journalist, recently saying that, well, Will Buxton asked him, what kind of driver are we going to get in Formula One? Because Mazepin's something of an unknown. And his response was he's going to be a driver that's going to push the rules as far as they can go within safety regs and blah, 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 to get the best result for the team. And on the face of it, you're thinking, yeah, that makes sense. Haas are a team that are at the back of the field. They often, to coin a phrase, YOLO their strategies a bit. Think about what they did with Magnussen at Hungary, which worked really well. I can imagine they do the same with Mazepin. But it only takes a cursory glance of Formula 2 highlights last year to see that Mazepin very often goes beyond the rules anyway. The amount of penalty points he accrued is pretty staggering for one season in Formula 2. He also was very poor the year before that at ART. He comes into this as, for me, the driver on the field with by far the least pedigree, even by comparison to Nicholas Latifi over at Williams. My unpopular prediction for the year is that Mazepin is going to score more points than Schumacher if he scores any, because of one of these alternative strategies that Haas put through. And I think it's going to be pretty close between the two drivers on account of the difficulties that Schumacher is going to have with that car. But aside from that, yeah, I mean, there is a reason to dislike Nikita Mazepin. And as much as I have tried to play devil's advocate with him, it is very, very difficult to do.
Well, as you can see, Josh has just brought the banner on, meaning that Josh is back. Josh, I guess I'm going to be quiet now. I'm going to hand back the stream over to you.
Yeah, Cam, we might be playing, catch with this hosting thing at the moment. But I did want, I mean, it's interesting, right, hearing you guys, because Haas has gone from sort of a known quantity with Grosjean and Magnussen to the complete opposite, to a completely unknown quantity. And it is quite a swing. And obviously we've seen teams have sort of normally gone for the, one experienced driver, one young driver. And it's interesting. I mean, I guess it's sort of by I mean, sort of by design, I guess they've gone for 2 young ones, partly for financial reasons, but also partly because, actually mainly for financial reasons. Let's not, hide away from it. So here's the car, and as people would guess, Haas came second bottom in the rankings. Nearly everyone except Joe, you had them 5th. So I don't know if you want to go through this one, why you had them 5th, and then maybe we'll ask any of the other 3 panelists as to why they had them near the bottom.
I've briefly commented on it. I just quite like it. I'm willing to ignore the Russian connections for a bit. It doesn't look bad. It's not cluttered with sponsors. The only thing I don't like is that the Haas logo is mirrored on the left-hand side, so it reads Saar backwards, not Haas. That annoys me. But apart from that, it's relatively clean. And ignoring the doping connections to it, the Russian flag's actually implemented quite well. But yeah, I know it's an unpopular opinion. And in terms of the actual quality of the race car, I'm not as optimistic.
Yeah, Luke, we haven't heard you weigh in on a car design yet. What did you make of the Haas car when it came out?
Similar to Joe in the sense that I think it looks quite nice. It's a nice design and it's clean. It kind of does exactly what it says on the tin. My issue with it and kind of the way that I rank the cars was to look at what the team's identity is meant to be. And if you look at Haas's kind of F1 Twitter account, it says America's team. And this couldn't be any further from representing kind of the United States of America. So yeah, I have to mark it down on that account. And as we'll kind of see later in the show, I guess, I don't have an issue with flag cars. I'm completely fine with that. I like some flags in my life, but no, this isn't one for me.
Yeah. It's the reaction's been very mixed per se. I know I was going on the F1 website and they launched a poll asking for people to comment their favorite design, and Haas got 1% of the vote. I'm not sure whether it's really for the design or for other reasons why they got so little of the vote. But interesting look. We will see. I mean, does anyone feel like it's an upgrade from last season? Does anyone feel that way?
What, livery wise?
Yeah,
because last year's car was boring.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, so it is sort of a step in the right direction. It clearly doesn't appease everyone. I guess that's what I was sort of alluding to. But to sort of bookend this Haas discussion, does anyone have them? I mean, we all sort of have them in that bottom 2. Does anyone have them second bottom? I guess they're duking it out with Williams, isn't it? So, Tom, do you want to? I mean, does anything from their testing give you any, expectation that they could finish beyond the bottom 2, or are we sort of expecting a season of a bit of struggle for them?
Personally, I don't see anything else but a complete loss for Haas. Not only because themselves have said they're willing to kind of sacrifice the season for the 2022 regulations, but also because I feel like other teams will come to Williams afterwards, have made some minor improvements that make Haas really the sole bottom team. If I could add something on the kind of livery, I think it's also showing Gene Haas's, so Haas's owner, may be wanting to step aside in the coming years after poor performances by the Haas team, and we could maybe see in a year's time the team becoming Russian under maybe Mazepin's dad's ownership. So I think it's just this Haas livery is just showing how this season is a season which they'll be very willing to forget in the whole for the whole team.
Yeah, it's gonna be a tough watch. It's gonna be difficult for them. Luke, is there? I mean, we've seen every now and then there'll be a race where an unexpected point scoring result kind of comes up for them. Do we anticipate many of these for Haas? I mean, is it again going to be a bit of a struggle because these are 2 new drivers, obviously getting their going to be growing throughout the season, learning, I guess, how to deal with these much more experienced competitors. Do you anticipate any any time that they might get a chance, be in the thick of the mix in terms of racing?
I mean, there's always a chance, isn't there? It just depends on how kind of the cookie crumbles. But I think the situation with Haas is that they're pretty much always going to be behind everyone else in the field. So if it is a straight fight between Haas and Williams for the last point, I would always back Williams because I think they'll have the faster car. But of course, in F1, there's always that opportunity where something happens on track and then you gain kind of the upper hand as a result of that. So no, I don't think you can count any team out of the mix completely over the course of the entire season. A lot can happen, but there isn't anything to suggest, for me at least, that they're going to be one of those teams that are kind of looking to secure in those points. I just think it's going to be a really, really long, tough season for them, kind of for a mixture of reasons. It is going to be difficult.
Yeah. It's going to be, I don't really feel like there's much more to say than it's going to be a tough one for Haas and the two drivers. Joe, do you want to end it? Yeah, you can end the discussion.
I'm going to make a very quick, specific prediction, as I always do. Specific predictions that will go wrong. Nikita Mazepin will score points for Haas at Zandvoort. Done.
That is very, very specific. That is very, very specific. So once we get to Zandvoort, and if that comes true, we will then turn to this moment and refer back to it. But anyway, let's move on from Haas. Funny enough, they lost out on the old on the 8th place in the rankings by 1 point, and they lost out to Williams, who came 3rd bottom or 8th, as to sound more positive, of the 10 teams. Hang on. Let me load the thing up. And actually, let's for now we'll take Joe off. We'll have Tom and Luke to go through this one. Let's see how it goes. So Williams, Luke, you had Williams 8th. So this sort of ties into your rankings at least. What do you make of the Williams car?
I don't hate it. I just find it quite difficult to see what is Williamsy about it. I think kind of unless you see it at a specific angle, it's quite hard to tell that it is a Williams. And I think essentially that's kind of task 101 of designing an F1 car. You want to be able to identify which car it is on track. Of course, over the course of the season, you'll get to learn that very, very quickly. But for me, unless you see it from the side and you see kind of the W at the top of the car, it's just very, very plain. If this is the direction they go in long term, then I think I'd change my mind because it becomes more of an identity thing. But for now, I just think it's fairly indistinguishable from lots of the other blue cars on the track this year.
Yeah. Tom, any thoughts on the car, or similar to Luke, really?
No, yeah, similar to Luke. What I'll say is that it looks better on track than in the renders. I think on track it looks a bit better. Still, the W, for me, is badly integrated. And when I must admit, when I first saw it, I didn't believe that could be that could be the actual livery. I put it last because I feel like a much better design could have happened. And for me, it's a major step back from last year's livery. Even though last year's was quite simple, I much preferred it.
Yeah, and let's bring Cam Hall on. Cam, as well as your thoughts on livery, I did want to ask you about the drivers, starting with George Russell, who obviously made huge strides last season, got a taste of what it was like to be at the front of the grid with the Mercedes car briefly. What are you expecting from him? Do you expect him to, I guess, continue development for sure? But how competitive and how much of a leap do you think he'll make from last season to this season?
Well, firstly, I put this livery as my first one. I was actually kind of debating between this one and the Alfa-Romeo, but I really like it. I can get the point you say about the sort of the identity of Williams, but I don't know. I quite like the kind of like the zebra stripe design within it. It is actually quite a kind of visually appealing car. I think I do. It's sure it's not the best I've ever seen, but I do really like it. I think it's something a bit different. It's not maybe conventional Williams, but I just really like it. And yeah, I know, very controversial opinion indeed, but I just kind of looked at that and I was like, yeah, this is actually quite nice. It's only compared to past Williams, which have been quite plain. I think it has a bit of life, a bit of character about it, and I really like that. But yes, George Russell. He is I guess if you say that Max Verstappen is the future of Red Bull, Charles Leclerc is the future of Ferrari, Lando Norris the future of McLaren, George Russell is the future of Mercedes. And he had that race where kind of everything seemed to be going right for him at Sakir last year before his really bad luck with the pit stop and then the slow puncture kind of in the end led to a result that really didn't show just how strong he'd been that weekend. George Russell had been very much on par, if not better, than Valtteri Bottas that weekend. And I think the pressure's on him now. The pressure is on him to kind of show and continue that form within the Williams. You know, he was a very strong qualifier last year. I think made Q2 more times often than not. So there's going to be a real push him. Can he keep that going, especially with the Williams that has shown that it's improved throughout pre-season testing? It's certainly better than the Haas, and it has shown some sizable improvements there. And George Russell has been very much at the forefront of that. So again, I think he'll need to work a bit more on his race pace and converting those qualifying results into finishing ahead of the Haas's, the Alfa Romeos, and all of those cars within the lower midfield back of the grid. I think he also needs to try and get some points for Williams. Obviously, he got the points with Mercedes, but I think just having those points with Williams, I think gives him that extra kind of bit of show that, you know, he is a driver that's been very much worth of all the hype. So I think that's very much a point on George Russell. But I think very much looking ahead to 2022, I think George Russell will be in that Mercedes car in 2022. So I think where we go from there, I guess in terms of, obviously we'll come on to Mercedes and we can talk a bit more about that second seat at Mercedes in a bit, because that is going to be a narrative that I think will certainly be perpetuated throughout the season. And George Russell will be at the centre of that, and how much Williams develop. Josh has asked me to retake the lead on the stream again. So let's bring Joe back in now. So I guess let's kind of just generally talk about where we see Williams this season. Is this, for them, a very similar situation like Haas, that they're looking ahead to 2022? We've seen some changes come in from the team over the winter. Jos Capito's come in now as its chief executive officer. Yesterday, FX de Mason, once of the Volkswagen Motorsport program and rallying, has come in as Williams' new technical director. Joe, is this very much, I guess, look at a season preparing for 2022, preparing for the regulation changes, or can Williams make more substantial steps this year?
Yeah, when I saw the Volkswagen hire, I immediately thought how many emission regulations the Williams F1 car is going to be breaching this year. Aside from that, there have been a lot of changes behind the scenes, as you've alluded to. The Doralton Capital takeover from last year. I mean, the identity of this team has very much changed, including the livery, which, aside from Lavazza, my favourite coffee brand, being on the car, I really don't like. I don't actually think they have the same excuse that Haas do this year, not least because in addition to the Mercedes power unit, which is probably still the best on the field, they've also got a Mercedes gearbox, a works Mercedes gearbox at that as well. Works perfectly with the power unit. Williams should be looking for some substantial performance improvements this year, probably reliability as well, considering that gearboxes are so strictly regulated in Formula One in terms of the amount of components you can have. My second prediction for the season that will definitely go wrong is that every team will score points this year. Unsurprisingly, I'm saying George Russell is going to score his first Williams points this year. I can't really say which kind of tracks it'll be at. I suspect it might be a race of attrition where there's a lot of retirements. Yeah, the car looks pretty balanced from what I can tell in testing. But again, it was kind of an uneventful testing. It's not like McLaren or Aston Martin where you can make real leaps towards it. I would say they'd make sizable improvements. It all kind of depends, as with a lot of these teams, on the Ferrari power unit. If it hasn't improved that much, it's feasible that Williams could outperform Alfa Romeo this year. If Ferrari really get their act together behind the scenes, then Alfa Romeo will have a little bit too much performance for Williams. Either way, I mean, the future of this team, financially at least, looks strong. Going into 2022, I'm more concerned about their driver lineup than the state of the car, believe it or not.
Well, I think it's going to certainly be interesting looking ahead to 2022. And of course, that driver lineup, I guess one cog within the Williams team, I say one cog, one driver within there, Nicholas Latifi. Is this a season for him to justify staying on for 2022? Or is this one where he's kind of just playing that second role to George Russell and maybe going to get much more of an opportunity when it comes to 2022. Luke, what do you think about Latifi?
I think it's hard to judge. I think, especially with kind of the way the British media frames the Russell versus Latifi thing as well, I think it's very much pitted as Russell being so dominant, and that's kind of what we've seen over the past couple of years as well. I think essentially you're right. It's very much a question of whether or not he's given the opportunity to kind of take the lead next year if Russell does move on. And essentially the only way in which he's going to be able to do that is if he outperforms Russell or gets close to Russell in the opening weeks of this season. It's going to be tough for him. I don't think there's any doubt about that because, again, we're talking about a car that's going to be towards the back of the grid. It's a results business at the end of the day, and I think Latifi does need to take a step up this year if he's to kind of hold on to his seat in Formula One.
Okay, and finally, then just going over to Thomas just to finish up on Williams. I guess firstly, what are your general prospects for Williams this season? Do you think that they can compete potentially with Alfa-Romeo, get into the lower end of midfield, and how do you think the season's going to end up going for George Russell?
Yeah, so I think firstly a big downfall of testing for Williams was on the Friday. It was Roy Nissany, the reserve driver, that drove for the entire day, and so meaning that both Latifi and Russell had half a day less in the car. And when you think it's only a 3-day testing period, that might have some effect in the first races. I think it's an interesting strategy that Williams is adopting. I think Josh Capito or people at Williams have said they're targeting certain types of tracks and are not hoping to be competitive everywhere. George Russell himself said the car was incredibly wind sensitive, which isn't a good sign for certain tracks, which, for example, long straight. And so we might see them struggling in tracks such as Monza, for example, if the wind is not with them. But as I believe Joe alluded to, I think we'll see Russell getting his first points. Even though last year he had a good chance at Imola, sadly, he crashed out on the safety car, I believe. But I still believe that George Russell is on good track for getting that Mercedes seat in 2022. And if he can just show, as he has done before, he can consistently beat Latifi in qualifying, for example, I think Williams can always take it as a good step forward if they're also challenging Alfa Romeo for that 8th spot in the championship.
It sounds like the sort of storyline that really should be mentioned on this year's Drive to Survive. Josh, I'm going to bring you back in now to retake over because I believe we're about to play a game of count how many AMGs you can spot on the car.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, we are. It's, again, fascinating discussion on Williams. I'll be, me personally, very interested to see how they do, how their drivers develop. I know Latifi has been given has taken some knocks on this show during last season. So we'll see if he's able to, namely looking at you, Joe, we'll see if he's able to, turn it around because the shelf life of an F1 driver isn't that high because there's only 20 slots. So you can bet there's so many people lining up behind Latifi for that spot. But let's switch over to, and for those listening, again, I'm just going to reinforce this. The order we've done this is on liveries, least impressive to most impressive, not our predictions. So if you hear Mercedes following Williams, we don't think that's going to be the championship order. I just want to put that out there. With that cleared up, yes, Mercedes was next, and also finished one vote above Haas. So really above Williams rather. So between Haas, Williams, and Mercedes, they were separated by 3 votes, which is probably the closest thing you've ever heard those 3 teams being close to. That's the closest sort of link between them. So we'll bring up the car design. They've gone with the black design again. Let's see where everyone's sort of rankings were. Everyone sort of had them in the bottom half of the 10 teams. Cam, you had the most highest of them at spot number 6. What do you make of the Mercedes car?
Well, I'm kind of surprised I had the highest one about Mercedes. I mean, the things I actually really like the black livery on the Mercedes car, and I also like I think what it stands for as well. And I think certainly, even though maybe not aesthetically the most pleasing, but certainly there's a certain message behind that car that I think is really important. And I think really does a good job on that livery. The AMGs, that I understand Mercedes, AMG, Daimler, you want to get the brand out, but I think I don't know, I haven't quite counted how many they are, but I think they're sort of verging on desperation a little bit. The fact it needs the whole of the engine cover just to say AMG. The driver numbers, I'm not the biggest fan of that either, the way they've displayed that on the engine cover. But I mean, apart from that, it's pretty average. It's a decent livery. It's kind of what we've come to expect from Mercedes and kind of what we came to expect following their livery last year. Nothing spectacular, but, at the same time, nothing of the Ferrari kinds.
Yeah, I was going to say their dash of red has clearly gone down a lot better than Ferrari's dash of green. Let's see. Everyone sort of had them 7th, 8th in terms of in terms of the impressive scale. Luke, you had them 7th. I mean, again, it is. I mean, this is sort of at this threshold, the teams that we've already gone through, and then including Mercedes. This is sort of the sort of expected average sort of level, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of agree with Cam. I think it's a really nice message behind the car. I think it kind of sticks to the identity really well. Like, what this car means and what Mercedes stand for. It would have been higher on my rankings if they didn't just spam loads of AMGs on the back of the car. It's just a really odd thing to do because everyone knows that the Mercedes AMG is just a weird situation. Again, I didn't write this in my article, but Cam's right about the numbers as well, that they're a bit odd. Would have been better as a solid colour. So yeah, it's okay. At least they've blended the colours though. That's a bonus compared to the Ferrari where they just didn't blend the two shades of red. I like the fact that it kind of blends at the back of the car. So yeah, that's another bonus. But for me, it's very firmly in the middle of the pack in terms of aesthetics.
Yeah, I'm going to leave this image lingering up here, the AMGs and the numbers, just for one final time before I remove it. Joe's looking repulsed. That's probably my cue to take it off. Let's talk testing, because this was this has been sort of the story of testing, or rather, maybe we're making too much of it. Maybe they are, as a lot of people have alluded to. Maybe they were sandbagging during testing. Tom, I want to get your thoughts because, and for those who don't know, Mercedes had a unimpressive testing by means of, to their standards, obviously, they looked a distant second to Red Bull in terms of race pace. What are your thoughts on this? Because we obviously know that teams, try hide the true capability of their car during testing. Obviously, teams have not been able to innovate much between last season and this season. What do you make of this? Because this has clearly been one of the big stories heading out of testing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, people like to say, oh, it's just Mercedes sandbagging again. But I really don't believe it's the case. I mean, if you compare last season's testing to this season's testing, there's quite a big difference. For example, like this year, Mercedes was the team with the least amount of laps completed, even less than the likes of Aston Martin. And so I believe that this year, the drivers have been complaining of a lack of rear grip. The car seems to be sliding everywhere. And we saw it when Hamilton, wanting to start a qualifying run, just spun on the last corner. So I do believe there's lots of problems on the stability of that car. Would I say they'll be not challenging for the title? No, I think we've all seen Mercedes domination the last 7 years, I still think they'll be in front. And I personally still think they'll manage to, by the end of the season, win the championship for an eighth time. I think at the start, we might see Red Bull beating them, certainly because recently Bahrain hasn't been a track which has favoured Mercedes, but I still believe that they'll be able to leave these issues behind them, and by the mid-season, I think we'll see them on top again.
And Joe, that's the thing, isn't it? Write off Mercedes at your peril, because for all we know, and we'll talk about Bahrain later, for all we know, they could end up on a 1-2 podium in Bahrain. It's a weird, it's an interesting discussion point, but equally it's a discussion point that could be very, irrelevant very quickly.
All of the commentators on Formula One testing, Alex Jakes, Will Buxton, Jolyon Palmer, Lawrence Barretto, they were all talking about this, and they say, well, on recent history, you wouldn't want to bet against Mercedes. Truth is, it's a damn sight more than recent history. I understand the issues with rear stability on the car. It was kind of what sunk Red Bull, and particularly Alexander Albon last season. But again, these guys Bottas and Hamilton, this is their 5th year together in this team. Ever since these new aero regs came in, Mercedes will have an answer to this, almost certainly. The resources they have, even with budget restrictions, I think they'll be absolutely fine. I, again, predict them for a manufacturer's championship. Not necessarily because Hamilton's going to have an incredible year, but because I think low-key Bottas is going to be a lot more impressive this year. But yeah, I still think they're going to win the championship because, if nothing else, I rate their leadership a damn sight higher than Red Bull's. And if you don't believe me, watch some of the last few streams.
Yeah, and I did want to, it's interesting, right, that key members of the Mercedes sort of hierarchy have been praising Red Bull, and you wonder if this is all a bit of a PR game and whether, this is all going to turn very quickly. Let's talk about the drivers. You mentioned Bottas. Luke, I guess we all sort of know Hamilton will be up there. So I guess that's not going to be the surprise. I think the interesting thing is how good will Bottas be, given that, and sort of because Red Bull are their main rivals, they've obviously upgraded their driver lineup with Perez in for Albon. It could put Bottas under pressure if, say, Sergio Perez was sort of matching him stride for stride. So what are you expecting on Bottas coming into the season?
Well, we got to see a lot of Bottas on Drive to Survive, so I think it's an interesting kind of insight into what the season is going to be like for him. I think the question for Bottas is really simple. He's going to face a sterner challenge from the second car of the Red Bull, and that's going to shake it up a little bit. I think he has to be better, and I think this year is his big opportunity to show it, because, of course, the discussion, I think one of the key narratives throughout this season will be about kind of the future of George Russell and the future of him as well, Valtteri Bottas, that is. So for me, I think there are signs that he could improve. It's just a case of saying, can he sustain it? Because what we've seen in recent years is he starts quite well and then dips off fairly rapidly. It is going to be an interesting one. I honestly think he's probably in for a better season than last year. I have no reason to back that up. I just honestly think that, given last year, I think some of the things that happened last year would have hurt him, and I think he'll come back fighting, and I think he's probably on for a slightly better season than last time out.
Yeah, and Cam, I turn to you because obviously we saw George Russell get a spell in the Mercedes car last season. That was sort of perceived as an audition, maybe, for his future prospects with that team. Obviously, Lewis Hamilton signed, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's a 1-year deal, a short-term deal at least. We don't know. He's earned the right to, I guess, walk away whenever he wants. So the clock is sort of ticking on that. It's interesting because this all has implications down the line for when Mercedes, I guess, when the new technical regulations come in. This all has implications of what the drive lineup could be for then, at least.
Learn to unmute myself first. This is going to be the biggest story throughout this year, no doubt about that, is who's going to be sat in that Mercedes in 2022. I think, as we said, George Russell getting in that car in Sakir last year, I think was a really important moment, because it was the first time I think we really got to see the second drivers, or the candidates for that perceived second driver spot to Lewis Hamilton, with George Russell and Valtteri Bottas. And George Russell more than handled himself against Bottas. In fact, I would say probably did better than Valtteri Bottas throughout the course of that weekend. And I think has really put himself in contention, and I think really put himself forward for saying, I deserve that seat in 2022. I think if George Russell has a season similar to what he had this year with Williams, as I said earlier, and impressive qualifying and can improve in the race, then I do think he will be sat in that Mercedes in 2022, because he is the future of the Mercedes program. But Lewis Hamilton only signing that 1 year contract. And again, it's important not to read too much into that. But the fact he's only signed that 1-year contract, the fact he's talked about a lot of other things outside of Formula One as well, and the fact that there are these regulations, these new regulations coming in next year, it wouldn't surprise me if Lewis Hamilton goes for the 8th title, goes for the 100th win, and then says at the end of the season, I've done what I needed to do in Formula One, now it's time for me to step back. Of course, that will then completely change the logic on the 2022 line. And Valtteri Bottas is not safe either. As we said, this is his 5th season at the team. He's only really been in one championship fight in 2019, and even that didn't really feel like he was ever in it compared to Sebastian Vettel in the 2 seasons before, even though the points difference kind of ended up being similar at the end. So unless Valtteri Bottas has a season where he's on top form and he's, I think, competing for that championship, or at the very least winning that second driver fight with Sergio Perez, I can't see him sticking around at the team in 2022. I don't know if this will be Mercedes' way of looking at the new regulations, and if Lewis Hamilton goes, seeing, right, this is our opportunity now to construct a completely new identity as a team, to go a completely different way. And there are plenty of drivers that they could go for. If they go with George Russell in one of the seats, Esteban Ocon, someone who's always been very heavily linked to Mercedes. We know that they have made admirations in the past for Max Verstappen, although we don't know whether that will be the case, whether he ends up getting the seat. Someone, perhaps if Carlos Sainz has a bad season at Ferrari, would he want to go? I'm not saying that he would, but would the offer of a lure of something like a Mercedes come appealing? So this fight for that second seat at Mercedes, whether it is as teammate to Lewis Hamilton, in which case I can see it being a Hamilton-Russell lineup in 2022, whether that is as teammate to George Russell, and then that brings Valtteri Bottas into that equation there. This is going to be the real story of the season, and there's going to be a lot of narratives, I think, very much kind of flowing on who is in contention to be driving in that second seat at Mercedes. And I think that's really going to dominate the season. The big player in all this really is Lewis Hamilton, and it's what he wants to do for 2022.
Yeah, it is certainly, foreboding, I guess, what's going to happen in 2022. And maybe Lewis Hamilton doesn't feel like, maybe he'll feel like he's done enough and he doesn't really want to dip his toe into 2022 and then again, the changes coming into the sport. So we'll see. I have 2 group-wide questions to finish off. First of all, the first one I feel like is a formality. I don't think anyone is brave enough to tip Red Bull ahead of Mercedes. No, I'm looking at facial reactions here. No, fair enough. Okay, this is the okay, so my second question is, how many of the group, of the panel, and just put up your hands if you think this will happen, and no hands, I guess, will signify you don't. This is really bad for podcast listeners, but oh well. I'll explain it to the podcast listeners afterwards. But how many of you feel Valtteri Bottas will finish second in the drivers' standings? Hands up if you do, and hands down if you don't. And I'm going to give it time. Joe looks right. You look pained.
I don't think he will, but I don't think finishing outside the top 2 is necessarily a bad result for him.
Okay.
If he finishes 3rd, that's fine, in my opinion.
Okay, interesting. We'll see what happens, but for the audio listeners, no one else put up their hand, so I'm guessing, and we'll move on to their rivals next, but I'm guessing everyone has Verstappen ahead of Bottas. Okay, we'll see. We'll see what happens. Whether that will have any whether that will have any impact on Bottas' standing heading into 2022, it's going to be interesting. Cam, you think Bottas is going to finish 4th, so Perez to finish ahead of Bottas. Just quickly.
Well, I think for context, I also predicted that Newcastle will finish ahead of Leicester in the Premier League this season. Okay. That has gone completely awry. But I'm looking, I think, firstly from testing, and I'm seeing how the fact that both Red Bull drivers seem to have really implied themselves well throughout the test. They seem to be happy with the car. I do think Mercedes will finish ahead of Red Bull. I do think, though, it's going to be very close. I think it will be similar to kind of what we get towards the end of the season normally, where Red Bull really pull through and it ends up being more neck and neck. I think Hamilton and Verstappen will finish ahead of the other 2. I think there will be a bigger difference. I'd almost say something almost like a 25 to 50 point difference between Hamilton and Verstappen in the end. I'd say the difference between Perez and Bottas, I think they could run neck and neck compared to the other second drivers that Red Bull have had in recent years. And in terms of my general views of the Red Bull driver lineup, I think this is the best driver lineup on the grid. And I think that what you have with Perez is a massive advancement on anything you've had recently at Red Bull as the second driver. So Bottas, I think if the cars are very neck and neck, I think he's going to have those races. And we've seen in the past, Bottas has had the fastest car on the grid, but he's not able to take it to the podium. He's struggling amongst the Ferraris and amongst the Red Bulls. And particularly if he keeps having issues with starts, like he kept on having towards the end of last season, and he's going to be in these battles and he's not going to be able to get, towards the top 2, the top 3. I see him getting very similar points to Perez, but coming just behind him. Mercedes only pulling through in the constructors because Hamilton has a substantial gap ahead.
Yeah. Well, that is plausibly could happen, and I guess there'll be more spotlight, on both teams in terms of their pit strategies and when they pit their drivers, because now they have second drivers who are, able to match each other, and so I guess that will be interesting in terms of race in race strategy as well. But that is a good transition to move towards Red Bull, and we'll start. We'll just keep going with the driver lineup since Cam brought it up. Obviously, this was the main story, the back end of last season, I would say, who was going to get that Red Bull spot. And in the end, it was not Alexander Albon, who I think he's been retained as the test driver, hasn't he? So he's still sort of involved with the team in a small capacity. But Sergio Perez got it. And Luke James, I dare say he earned it because his performances towards the end of the season were spectacular, given that he was in a racing point.
Oh, definitely. He was really, really good towards the end of the season and totally deserved the seat. I think the only reason it came off a little bit harsh was simply because, of course, final couple of weekends of the season, Albon also improved as well. But yeah, no, I think Perez definitely deserves a place in Formula One, both for his contributions on the track. He's incredibly quick, incredibly talented, and has shown that he can kind of fight at the top end of the track. The other reason why he's so attractive to have in F1 is because he brings in sponsors and he has a really authentic following behind him. So I think if you're a clever kind of team manager, you want Perez because he brings the results and he also brings another layer to your team. And I think that's something that's especially important in Formula One kind of going forwards beyond this year and into 2022 as well. And I think as a whole, it just brings the floor for Red Bull much, much higher. I think with Alex Albon, there was always a risk of you don't really quite know what you're going to get. And to be completely honest, I think they handled the Albon situation abysmally. Probably was never meant to be in that car in the first place. But now they have two drivers that really can compete. And it's a totally different dynamic this year. I think the really interesting question going forwards is how close Perez can get to Verstappen. I'm intrigued to see that. And I think that's the narrative that could be interesting as we enter kind of the first couple of weeks of the season.
Yeah. And Max Verstappen, obviously, Tom has had. He's had a meteoric rise in the sport, and obviously last year he had some really good performances. There were also times where luck just seemed to desert him. I think it was Istanbul, or there were a few races towards the back half of the season where some sort of mechanical failure forced him to exit early when he was really looking to really take the battle to the Mercedes. So, assuming and hopefully those issues are past him, he should be able to give it a real go this year.
Yeah, definitely. I rate Max really highly. I think he's top 2 on the grid right now with Lewis Hamilton. I think he'll do wonders with that Red Bull. He's now been in the team for quite a while, even though he's still young. He's one of the most mature drivers on the grid, I believe, except his incident with Turkey last year where he lost it trying to overtake Hamilton. I think he's proven that he can keep cool, keep on always deliver for Red Bull. And that was seen in Abu Dhabi by far and away. That last race of 2020, that Red Bull was the best car. Verstappen put it on pole, won the race, and he was far ahead of Lewis or Valtteri. So I think that dynamic will continue on. And obviously, sadly for Gasly and Albon, going up against such a teammate is always an incredible struggle. but I think Perez will manage much better. It's the first time in a long while that they've picked someone outside of the Red Bull Driver Academy, but I think it's a much needed change. And I've really got high hopes for Perez in that seat. But still, I think Verstappen will easily beat Perez over the whole season due to his incredible consistency and maybe even the team favouring him as they have done for the last 2 seasons.
Yeah, so let's bring up there we go. There's the Red Bull car. Joe, I know you have a quick comment to make, and honestly, the design didn't really. I mean, there weren't really any surprises with this one. But I know you have something to say on it.
I mean, just quickly on the design, I don't like the impetus of putting new designs higher. So I think I had this 4th on my rankings simply because it's worked in the past. It kind of works this year. I wish the Indigo was a little more lurid like it used to be back when it was Vettel and Webber at the team. Aside from that, it's fine. The big point to make on this is technically coming out of testing, this car is a hell of a lot more balanced last year. I'm not going to go into the whole situation last year. I agree with Luke. I don't think Albon should ever have been in the car. Personally, as a Gasly fan, I think he was treated abysmally. But the reason why Gasly and Albon struggled is because of how difficult that car was to drive and just how well it was geared to Max Verstappen's driving style and a bit of favoritism on the Christian Horner end of things. The point is that this car is so much more drivable. That is going to be why Perez is so much closer this year. If Perez is as far off the pace as Albon was in particular, then that is honestly on Sergio Perez. I don't think it's going to be a problem for him. For the first time, Red Bull have a car which is actually manageable. And as a result, it's really the Perez improvement in that second car that's going to bring them so much closer to Mercedes this year. With that said, I still think they're going to finish second.
Yeah, and I dare say, it's going to come down to the fine margins. We saw Mercedes had issues with their pit stops at times, they had issues with their strategy at times, and that's sort of the fine margins I guess Red Bull will look to exploit and get those little gains that may give them a fighting chance in this. So yeah, I don't know if there's too much to add about. I think we're all of the opinion that Verstappen will probably obviously finish ahead of Perez. Perez, we assume, is going to finish 4th in the top 4. Does anyone see him finishing outside the top 4? For the audio listeners, everyone shook their head. So no. So yeah, I feel like that's pretty. I mean, I think Red Bull previewing Red Bull pretty straightforward. They had a really great testing, as people have alluded to. So we will see if they are able to carry it through. But definitely exciting time if you're a Red Bull fan. Let's move on. Actually, what is next on the rankings? It is actually, and this is, I know, Luke, you have to head off soon, but this was your top 2 pick, your second pick. And we're referring to Aston Martin, who back sort of in the sport, I guess, formerly known as Racing Point. For those who don't know, Lawrence Stroll obviously took over the Aston Martin brand and has now made that the car. It's an interesting car design. Well, I'll get it. But Cam, are you excited to have Aston Martin in the sport, I guess, under the guise of Aston Martin?
I think the thing with Aston Martin you've got to remember is it's not really Aston Martin. It is the Racing Point machine that was Force India, that was before that Spiker and Midland, and was before that Jordan. So, the crux of the team is the exact same. The only difference now is not only do you have the Aston Martin brand, but you have the money that Lawrence Stroll firstly put in with Racing Point, but even more money that he's now put in through the Aston Martin brand. This is a team that has historically always done well with limited resources. It's a team that's been very resourceful and is one that has always made the most of not really having much. Now it's got a lot. I think it'll be really interesting to see, obviously, where these kind of marginal gains that they've exploited in the past, whether they can do that on a much grander scale. Of course, the budget cap is going to limit them from what they would have been able to do in the past and spend as much money as they like, because they've now got the ability to do that. But yes, certainly it's going to be an interesting season for Aston Martin. I'm looking forward to seeing what they can do. I think this is going to be one of very much, certainly from what we've seen from testing so far, I don't think they're going to perhaps be as prolific as they were last year. I feel this is going to be one of settling the brand, settling Vettel, into the team and then getting ready for 2022. But I do think this is going to be a fairly reasonable year for the Aston Martin team. And of course, just one last thing to say on the livery. I am getting very big Caterham vibes. I don't know if it's just because it is all green, but I can't get the Caterhams of the early 2010s out of my head.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about the livery. You obviously ranked it quite highly. It was your second favorite one. And obviously, if I remember, the presentation itself was quite star-studded with Daniel Craig and other big names sort of being able to show off the car. It was quite a splashy celebration, and that car is quite splashy in terms of its color palette.
Yeah, I really like it. A quick word on the car launch. I don't know if anyone else watched it. There was the most horrifically cringeworthy moment in the Q&A afterwards because the presenter was reading from a script and at one point wasn't sure who she was meant to be asking the question to. So she asked, who am I meant to be asking the question to? And it remained in the final cut. So yeah, that was a bit of a weird situation as a whole. But no, I love the car. I think it looks great. I like the fact it's kind of British racing green. I like the fact, as Cam says, it is obviously a Racing Point with an Aston Martin badge on it, essentially. But I like the fact that they're trying to kind of bridge the gap towards the heritage of the team as a whole. I also quite like the pink. I think the pink kind of, it loses some marks because of that. And we saw that kind of the pink was meant to be a more fluorescent green, but I think it looks fine. I like the fact it's got a little bit of a nod to the past and kind of in terms of how the Racing Point looks. So yeah, I think it looks quite cool. I quite like it. One of the funny things as well from the launch of the Aston Martin this year and the launch of the Racing Point from the previous year that showcased in Drive to Survive is that Lance Stroll said exactly the same thing at both events. So in Drive to Survive, talking about the Racing Point, he said, yeah, well, if it drives as good as it looks, other teams will be in trouble. And this year he said kind of words to exactly the same effect. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, no, I like it. It looks cool. And I think that's all you really want. Yeah, I'm a fan. I think, as Lance Stroll would say, if it drives as good as it looks, they're in for a decent season.
And I know you have to go soon. So I did want to just get your general sort of thoughts, predictions. I mean, what are you most looking forward to ahead of the season, and what are you looking forward to seeing in Bahrain this weekend?
I just hope there's an actual battle at the front, because it's been a long time since anyone really had any doubt about whether or not Mercedes were going to be the dominant team. I think there's still some kind of... I'm very apprehensive to believe the idea that Mercedes have lost so much time over the winter, because the regulations meant that they couldn't change that much about the cars. So I don't really see how Mercedes could have lost so much time to Red Bull, considering the season that they had last year. So I think there is a little bit of kind of PR war going on between Red Bull and Mercedes. So yeah, I think the battle at the front is going to be really interesting. The other thing to kind of look out for is, I think, Ferrari, because they need to have a bounce back year, because it was historically abysmal. And if this was a sport where you'd be drafting people, you would accuse Ferrari of kind of burning it to the ground and hoping to pick up some good draft picks. So they really do need a better season to kind of just increase morale, because it was quite ridiculous at the Italian Grand Prix last year, where kind of the Alpha-Tauri was kind of flying the flag for Italy. So that was a really strange situation. In terms of the midfield battle, I think there's lots of talk about how Alpine might have taken a step back compared to the other two. It's going to be interesting for McLaren. If they can hold on to third in the constructors' standings, that will be a huge coup for them. And I think that's definitely something to look out for. I did a quick prediction on Twitter earlier. I still think Hamilton will win, with Verstappen second and Bottas third. In the constructors, I had it as Mercedes, Red Bull, and Aston Martin. Although whether that's more hope than expectation will remain to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I guess the openness of that mid-table battle is going to be one of the more exciting aspects heading into the season. But Luke, thank you so much for joining us for the brief time you had. Obviously, for the visual watchers, your Twitter is coming around on the banner. For people on audio, you can obviously follow your Twitter at LukeJames_32. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in a bit. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. See you later.
All right, that was Luke James, and I'll bring back Cam and Thomas. Actually, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, Tom, if you have any more comments on the car before we talk about the drivers. I mean, it's a bold look, I guess, for the new owners.
Yeah, definitely. I personally put them second too, I believe. I really like how the car looks. I was also a bit wary of them when I heard that BWT was staying on. I was scared that the pink would be badly integrated, but that shade is well put. And I honestly really like the car. If I could briefly talk about testing, the car does look good, but it doesn't look good on track because we haven't seen them much on it, honestly. A lot of problems throughout the 3 days meant that Vettel, who's the newcomer to the team, did not have enough laps on the Bahrain circuit. And I think that might be an issue going forward. I still believe they'll be near the top of the midfield. The Mercedes-powered team was last year at the top, third best car, I believe, should have got third place in the championship. Sadly, didn't for them. But I think at the start, seeing as though Vettel did not get enough time on the circuit, Bahrain might be a bit difficult for them. But I've got high hopes for the future.
Yes, and yeah, I mean, they had a very interrupted testing, as you've sort of alluded to. I mean, I guess my thoughts on the car design is, I guess for new fans, it'll be something quite eye-catching, and I wonder if it'll pay off and they'll bring in new fans to the team. But as you guys have as you and Cam have alluded to, obviously they've as opposed to Haas with the two new drivers, they've gone with the experienced driver in Vettel, and Lance Stroll, who I know has had a few seasons, still sort of finding his way. I guess not quite the finished product yet. Let's start with Lance Stroll, actually, because obviously and certainly my perception of him has been, he has obviously got the seat from privilege, but he has slowly started to convince me. And certainly last season, he had I think it was Turkey, wasn't it? That was the big one where he took pole and had a very strong display. Cam, I mean, he's sort of finding his groove. He's sort of finding himself in this sport. And, I'm wondering, how do you think he'll develop going forward?
Well, Lance Stroll got both the Williams and the Force India seat originally, as you said, through the money that Lawrence Stroll, his dad, was able to provide. But he is a talented driver. And you only have to look at him in the junior formula to see the fact when he was a part of the Ferrari Driver Academy, he won races, he won championships. He was a driver with a record that could easily justify going into Formula One. Last season, he had the car to be able to do things. And again, the thing with Lance Stroll is there are flashes of excellence that you see from him. He could and probably should have won the race in Monza had he not made that mistake on the restart going off at the second chicane. He probably should have won in Turkey. I reckon if he hadn't made that second pit stop in Turkey, I reckon he might have been able to win that race. He was out on ahead for much of that race. So the thing with Lance Stroll, there's these flashes of brilliance that he has, but the problem is that they're not consistent enough. And there are those races with Lance Stroll where it is frustrating sometimes that there's someone who clearly has the potential and someone who has shown it in many other races what he can do. But then he'll just sort of languish a bit. It's not like I don't think he's not giving the most, but he's just not getting the most out of the car that he should be compared to Sergio Perez, who by the end of the season was doing absolute wonders in that racing point. So Lance Stroll is clearly talented, but he needs to be producing it on a more consistent basis. Now, I don't know how the impact that Sebastian Vettel will have on him. Sebastian Vettel tends to like teams being sort of organised around him, which will be very interesting dynamic with Lawrence Stroll, the owner of the team, who we don't know if he'll be trying to push for his son to have more of an influence within that team compared to Vettel. But I think certainly Lance Stroll could be the future of that team. But he needs to learn from Vettel. I think he's got someone who I think will really help him and someone who could be a good mentor to him. But he needs to be showing a more consistent performance, because I think if Vettel can dial back in to the Vettel of old that we saw in the days of Red Bull, that we saw in the early days of Ferrari, and really get the best out of that car, then, come 2022, if Aston Martin do have the fastest car on the grid, like they say they want to have, Vettel could be out front doing really well. And Stroll could just be very inconsistent. That's what he needs to sort out. Stroll needs to become a more consistent driver this season. So if Aston Martin, get to a stage in the future where they are out front and you do have Sebastian Vettel doing extremely well, Lance Stroll needs to be there to be able to back the team up.
Yeah, and actually, Tom, I wanted to ask you, what Cam touched upon, looking at the other driver, obviously, Sebastian Vettel, it'll be very interesting to see how his dynamic is with Lawrence Stroll. We know, to put it mildly, he can be outspoken. He'll voice his displeasure with the car, with the team, if he feels that way. He's certainly not afraid of doing so. And obviously, he's coming off an unsuccessful stint at Ferrari. It's certainly not the way he would have hoped for it. And certainly, there are some fans out there who may be sort of a bit more down on him just because of his recent stint at Ferrari. It does feel like this is a bit of a big year for him in terms of proving himself once again. This is a challenge for him. Do you anticipate that it's going to go all well for him, or do you feel like again we're going to see cracks of displeasure with the team, cracks of his outspoken personality coming out? What do you reckon?
Yeah, so it's definitely a major year for Vettel. Last year was probably his worst season in Formula One. He kind of lost his mojo, and it's time at Aston Martin that he found it again. Obviously, Charles Leclerc was favoured, some will say, at Ferrari, and that might be the reason why he was so far ahead of the four-time world champion. But Vettel will have a very, very difficult job. Not only is he stepping in the shoes of Sergio Perez, who we now see is at Red Bull and had an incredible season, probably his best season as of yet. And so, but it's also getting to know this new team. The first time he'll have a Mercedes-powered car. So it'll be important for him to get to grips quickly if he wants to challenge for podium this year. I think it will be a close battle with Stroll, honestly. I don't see him doing as well as Perez did last year. But I believe that he'll bring the experience, the much needed experience. And so we can hope that for 2022, if he sticks around, which he probably will, he'll help the car develop to new heights. So it is a very important season for Vettel. And it will be interesting, the dynamic he has with Stroll, because Stroll has, as Cam said, his moments of brilliance, and Vettel also did. So it will be important. It will be interesting to see how they match up, not only in the races but also in qualifying. Because as we mentioned, Stroll did get a pole in Turkey last year, and it will be interesting to see in Bahrain certainly whether or not Vettel has gotten used to that car, because he loves cars with planted rears, which wasn't the case at Ferrari, but was the case at Red Bull. So maybe he'll find that normality again. And now with a British team that he does like, I think in the future, so 2022 onwards, it may be an ideal partnership, him and Aston Martin. I just believe that 2021 will be an incredibly tough year. And if he does beat Stroll convincingly, it will show that he still had the capabilities and he can still win world championships if Aston Martin does have the car.
Yeah, and I want to bring Joe in for this question. There's two final questions I have to wrap up this sort of Aston Martin preview. First of all, and it's interesting because I don't think that it's not a clearly defined maybe first, second driver, or maybe there is. I don't know. Let's start with that. Do you think that's the sort of dynamic we're heading into this Aston Martin team, or is it sort of more like 1A, 1B, certain weekends one might have it, certain weekends others might have it?
I imagine they'll probably try and stay equal status at first. It may be a situation where you get to the end of the season, for example, and if one's clearly more ahead than another, then they may start to favour one driver over another. But of course, Sebastian Vettel has always done best when he is the clear number one in the team. And I don't know if there will be some early pressure from Seb going, look, I need you to build this team around me. I will deliver. Look what I've done in the past when people have built teams around me. I've delivered. Now, I don't know if the last couple of years at Ferrari might have harmed him doing that, but certainly I think Aston Martin, I think there will be an incentive to keep it at least equal at first. Perhaps maybe just seeing better in the last couple of years, giving him that time to dial in. But perhaps in the mid-term, if they do see Lance Stroll as a long-term option, Sebastian Vettel may be the mid-term option, of course, before he starts declining, which, could feasibly come within the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how. We have a whole season, I guess, to sort of uncover and see how this relationship goes. I guess my other one was I was recently in a discussion about the top 10 F1 drivers in history, and Sebastian Vettel within that conversation it was undecided whether he made the list, and then I think he did make the list. I can't remember because I was sort of pretty busy doing something else, but. How does anyone have him in the top 10? I know this is a discussion we can table for another day because obviously that's a whole another hour we could tack onto this. But does anyone have him there? And if not, does this Aston Martin stint, will that be something that could potentially move him up or move him down towards that? Joe, you unmuted, so I'm assuming you have something to add on.
Yeah, to be honest, I unmuted myself, but I don't really have an answer. You've sprung the top 10 on me right now. There are a lot of sort of drivers who didn't really get given the chance or sadly passed away before they had the chance that I would probably put ahead of Sebastian Vettel. I don't know if he makes my top 10. Not really an insult. And it seems weird for a 4-time world champion, but yeah, I personally, just quickly, I think there is a very real chance that if this Aston Martin team treats Seb badly, i.e. does not treat him as the first driver that he should be, that he walks away from the team, maybe even the sport at the end of the year, before the new regs come in.
Yeah, it's interesting because he hasn't been the type of driver and we'll get onto Fernando Alonso in a bit, but he hasn't been the type of driver to voice that he wants to do IndyCar, or at least to my knowledge, he hasn't really voiced sort of that desire. So this seems to be all his eggs in one basket, I guess, in terms of motorsport. So will be fascinating to see how that pans out. And with that, let's go to some of the mid-table rival who also finished, again, in this livery rankings, 3rd to 5th also were separated by 1 point each. So in 4th, we go to McLaren, who I think everyone want to talk about because that's sort of the fan favorite team at the moment. It's sort of the team that have got the most fan attention per se because of their lineup. But before they get to the lineup, we'll just briefly show their car. Again, not a huge divergence from last season's design. Here it is. Cam, I think it's pretty much, it's, again, as I said, not much change from last year, but still a very solid looking car.
Yeah, I really like this car. I think I put it in 4th, and it's just a nice car. The papaya orange at the McLaren, again, is a really good history behind that. That I think that's something I quite like on cars. So again, that really boosts the livery there. I think the blue and orange is just something that has worked. I think it's just a nice look. And McLaren, I guess, don't spend your money on the paintwork for the livery. Spend it integrating that Mercedes engine into the car. It's decent. Again, it's not solid. It's not spectacular. But, it's not totally bad. It's sort of bog standard from McLaren, but it's a slightly nicer looking bog standard, I think, than compared to what we said about the Mercedes and the Red Bull.
Yeah, certainly stands out a bit more than those designs in terms of noticeable changes. So again, I don't know if anyone else has too much to say on the design. Feel free to stop me if anyone does. Joe, you unmuted yourself.
All I'll say is that I think I put it 2nd overall. Again, going on from what I said about Red Bull, just because it hasn't changed doesn't mean it's not really, really good. I really like this. I'm not normally a fan of orange on anything, so the fact that it works so well on this McLaren, partly to do with history, but also it's just a really elegant looking car. I love the rainbow towards the back of the side pods. The blue is stunning. The font of the numbers, yeah, it's a nice looking car, and it's going to have one hell of a popular driver lineup this year.
Well, let's talk about the driver lineup because I feel like that's the big thing with McLaren heading into this year, at least the big attraction to it. Daniel Ricciardo joins McLaren, having had I don't know. I know he wanted to challenge himself at Renault. I don't think it went as well as he'd have hoped. But clearly, and he made the decision that McLaren long-term were going to be a better fit for him. And so he's now made that move. He obviously partners Lando Norris, who, as we sort of alluded to with the discussion on Sainz, didn't necessarily get like outrightly beaten by Sainz, but still, maybe 1A, 1B, sort of the slightly inferior option between the two in terms of performances. So a new challenge for Lando Norris. Tom, I mean, this is, like I said, this is, I guess, the standout lineup that everyone has sort of been gushing over, Formula One fans, because suddenly you put one fan favorite next to another fan favorite, and it's, we all expect it to go very well.
Yeah, completely. Two of the most popular drivers on the grid in the same team, in a McLaren team, which is also one of the most popular teams on the grid. So it's a win-win for everyone, and everyone will be all eyes on McLaren this season to see how they do. It will be interesting for Ricciardo. Obviously, he left Red Bull at the end of 2018 to join Renault. His stint at Renault had its ups, for example, his 2 podiums last year, but also a lot of difficulties, some crashes, some retirements. And so I think it's a much needed change for Daniel. And I believe that it was the right choice, because going forward into 2022, I think McLaren will be one of the favourites. But if we look at 2021 and testing, all went well for McLaren, nothing wrong. The Mercedes engine seems to be well integrated in that machine. I believe they used their 2 tokens on it, and so it seems to work smoothly. I believe Ricciardo topped the time charts on the Friday and the Saturday. So I really don't feel like it'll take time for him to get used to this new environment. He seems to be bonding well with the team, and also bonding well with Lando Norris. I think, as Cam said earlier, I also believe that Sainz did perform much better than Lando Norris in the first year, and still better in the second year. And seeing as though Ricciardo seems to have got used to the car quite quickly, I believe that Ricciardo will convincingly beat Norris this year too, even though Norris seems to be the future of McLaren. I still believe that Daniel Ricciardo now knows that McLaren is his last shot at as a much wanted world championship. And so I think he'll be willing to stay for the long term at McLaren. So I believe that this lineup is one we'll be seeing for the next 2 to 3 years at least. So buckle up. It's going to be a fun ride.
Absolutely. And Cam, everyone, as Thomas sort of said, are on board with this driver lineup for sure. But inevitably, there will be competition between the two. There will come a time where, maybe one driver will need sort of an advantage more than the other one. Maybe in a certain race or so, maybe needs the advantage of having a pit stop first or something like that. Do we anticipate any friction between the two drivers? And if so, would they be able to kind of put it to a side, moving forward? Or do you anticipate that it could boil over a bit more than that?
I think the interesting thing, if you kind of talk to people around the F1 community, is that there's this real sense that, Lando Norris and Daniel Ricciardo are 2 very much kind of jokers amongst the pack. And I think what many people are suggesting is that, well, you have these 2 jokers, and then all of a sudden having 2 in the same team, it's like having too many cooks. The broth will be spoiled. It's not going to be a particularly good look. And, what could happen as a result of that, you could see some sort of anguish between the 2 drivers, sort of rivalry developing that may just not be good for the team and may hold them back. I think it'll be an interesting one, because I think that McLaren do, obviously Daniel Ricciardo, if the McLaren are seeking sense here, they're going to put Daniel Ricciardo as their number 1 driver. He has the experience of winning races, of getting a team sort of at the lower end of the top tier, but the high end of the midfield, up towards podiums, up to winning races. He's someone who's got the experience as well. So I have no doubt that Danny Rick should be the number 1, but McLaren have put a lot in Lando Norris and invested a lot into him. Now, if you watch episode 8 of Drive to Survive, you may think that there is going to be this conspiracy that may Ricciardo, that Norris is going to be the person at the front. I don't believe that's the case. I just think McLaren are going to want to push, I think, whomever is doing the best at the time. And naturally, that will be Ricciardo. Ricciardo will be their best shot of getting them towards the front. So, yeah, obviously, it'll be interesting to see if the banter does overstep the line between the two drivers. And I think that's going to be the dynamic there. But certainly with the drivers in terms of their speed, Ricciardo is the faster driver. I expect he'll be the faster driver throughout the season. But I think Norris will also be up there. Again, similar to what he was, I think, more towards the start of 2020.
Yeah, I can definitely see a scenario where the two rival fandoms sort of turn against each other at some point. Something, I guess, I don't know if anyone anticipates team orders, but it certainly isn't in the style of both drivers. And so if they end up colliding with each other or something like that, which I don't wish upon them, but is a possibility. So fireworks are going to go off. Tom, I just want to end with you've made a bold prediction in the private chat. I'd love for you to voice it on this. And we'll leave it there. I guess how high? I guess I'll give you the question of how high is the ceiling of this McLaren team this season, and what kind of heights can you see them kind of reaching?
Yeah, I think it was a practically perfect preseason testing for them. I mean, obviously, we can't look too much into that, but I still believe that if in a certain race, Mercedes and Red Bull had problems, or we see a Monza-type race this year, McLaren will be the best team to pounce on it. And that's why I'm predicting Ricciardo to get a race win this season with McLaren, because I really believe this McLaren is in a zone. It's not as fast as the Red Bull and the Mercedes, but for me is faster than the rest of the midfield. So I believe there'll be a comfortable third in the championship, and we'll be able to get these odd podiums for both drivers, but also a challenge for a race win if a Monza-style race does happen in the end, which will probably be the case as we go to new tracks such as Zandvoort, for example.
Yeah, I think, and I don't really feel like I need to ask Cam. I feel like you have them third as well in the team standings rather. So yeah, it should be an exciting for McLaren. Obviously, yeah, I think Ricciardo signed a multi-year deal, so I feel like this is the partnership going forward for at least 1 or 2 years, and will be interesting to see if anything changes between now and then. But we'll move on swiftly to the third ranked livery, and that is Alpha-Tauri. So I'll bring Joe back on because I know Joe's a big Gasly fan, so hang on. Let me share the screen again. Actually, to be honest, Joe, I'll ask you as I share this. The car didn't change too much in terms of design, but it's still a very good-looking car.
I think I had it quite low on the rankings, honestly, because they've more or less flipped where the blue and white were last year, or at least that's what it looks like to me. I personally thought last year's car was a lot more appealing. I don't like the slightly narrower nose. I know it's not to do with the livery. It's more of an engineering point. I don't like the front end of the car, visually speaking, this year. But again, as is often the case with these development teams, the drivers are a far more interesting proposition.
Yeah, you had them 6th, I think, on your rankings. Not terribly low, but yeah, certainly in the average sort of tier. Let's talk the drivers, because again, I feel like same thing McLaren. I think the driver lineup is the intriguing part, and going off testing, Tom. At least the final day of testing, or the second or the middle final day of testing, Yuki Tsunoda turned a lot of heads with the amount of pace he was able to get, albeit he was on a different tire compared to the other drivers. That should be taken into account. But it seems like he's acclimatized pretty well to the F1 car, which, that's pretty exciting heading into the season.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, Tsunoda's lap obviously comes with some caveats. So, for example, the DRS, how he used quite a bit more DRS than what's allowed around that track. But still, it doesn't stop the fact that that car looked incredibly stable. It was agile. Tsunoda didn't make many corrections during that lap. It does seem like a very quick car. And I think the whole team is taking important steps forward. I mean, last year, obviously, with their win in Monza with Gasly, I think things are looking up for them. And sadly, it's the last year with the Honda engine, but the Honda engine is really coming into its own, I feel, this year. And so I'm expecting them to be very much in the midfield battle, challenging Alpine, challenging Aston Martin, challenging Ferrari. And I really think the driver pairing is a really great one. Pierre Gasly brings the experience and is no doubt the leader of this team now. But Tsunoda has had a meteoric rise from, I believe, the F4 championship in Japan only 3 years ago to Formula One. So it showed that he gets to know the cars quickly, and he knows how to really hit the ground running. And I really think that'll be the case this year. So a very interesting prospect in Yuki Tsunoda. And Gasly, I mean, Joe will be able to talk more about him, seeing as though it's his favorite. He's his favorite driver. But I really think that Gasly is an incredible driver, demoted from Red Bull far too soon. And I think that he'll be able, even though he's only in his third year, I believe, in Formula One, I think he brings the necessary experience. And it will be really interesting to see how they fight the other cars on track this year.
There we go. Yeah, Joe, I did want to bring you in because obviously, I mean, you actually watch I think you, at least compared to me, you know a lot more about Tsunoda, having watched him a bit in the lower categories of the sport. But also, as you are a fan of Gasly, and I think for me, it's interesting to see how he adapts to having experienced the highs of last season, the maybe unexpected highs of last season, and then. I don't want to say come down to earth because I still feel that the Alpha-Tauri car is going to be competitive, but suddenly it's not going to be. We're not expecting him to win another Grand Prix, I don't think. So it'll be interesting to see, I guess, how he deals with regularly kind of competing for that sort of maybe that 8th spot in the top 10, 7th spot when it's the points are sort of fewer. But it's just I guess bringing his expectations a little bit down to earth. I'm curious to know what you think of both drivers, I guess, going off that.
To be honest, I've got an awful lot of hope for Alpha-Tauri this year. There were a lot of points last season when, as Luke James said earlier, they were genuinely the best Italian team, which at Mugello and Monza was pretty embarrassing for the Scuderia Ferrari. I wasn't as much on the Tsunoda hype train as a lot of people were last year, despite the fact he did have, by all accounts, an impressive rookie season in Formula 2. I argued, this is my Formula 2 nerd coming through, but that was largely as a result of the amount of favouritism the Carlin team put on him over Jehan Daruvala. That's another point. He has looked very impressive ever since that first test. People are talking about his low centre of gravity. The truth is, you need a hell of a lot more than that to be a great Formula One driver. And when you compare the rookie that Tsunoda is to the supportive atmosphere at Alpha-Tauri, led by Franz Tost, of course, who is a million miles away from what Christian Horner and Helmut Marko are at Red Bull, with Pierre Gasly as well, who is, by all accounts, one of the best drivers on the grid, in my opinion. But he's also a thoroughly likable driver. He's not the kind of guy that stirs up drama. As a senior driver and a mentor for Yuki Tsunoda, I don't think you could find that many more better drivers than him in all of motorsport, let alone Formula One. My question is, my question is, where does Gasly go after this year? I can't imagine Red Bull are going to keep him for another year in Alpha-Tauri with new regs if they haven't got plans to use him later on. I feel like he could be the new Carlos Sainz, who again wasn't given much of a chance by the Red Bull hierarchy in favour of Max Verstappen. But honestly, after testing and how good this car looks, and crucially how drivable this car looks, I wouldn't be surprised to see Alpha-Tauri ahead of either Aston Martin or Ferrari in the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships this season.
Yes, and I do want to give the sort of, I'll ask Cam Hall, because Alpha-Tauri, just in general, I guess last season, because, everyone's sort of seen, because obviously they were formerly known as Toro Rosso, they were seen as the feeder team. No one sort of saw them as being this legitimate mid-table threat. And so I guess maybe they caught people out by surprise last year, just how quick they were, even, getting close to or matching Red Bull. That surprise factor is no longer there. But regardless, I guess, of that being there, I mean, obviously, so expectations obviously lifted, but they're also well capable of matching them just because we've seen what Gasly can do against the very best.
Well, this was undoubtedly Alpha-Tauri's best season in Formula One since its Toro Rosso days back in 2008, when they did also win a race at Monza, funnily enough, that season. But the thing with Gasly and the thing with Alpha-Tauri, and towards the end of the season with Danny Kvyat as well, was that car was consistently lapping in the top 10. The drivers were able to get a lot out of it. And we saw at Spa, for example, the strategy they used to pit Pierre Gasly through the end. They knew that car would be quick enough to get points, to get into the top 10. And I think he came 7th by the end of the race. So very much like 2008. I think it was a case that they knew they had a good car. They knew they had a solid midfield car that they knew could score big points on the right day. I think this will be the same with this car. I mean, testing has been very encouraging. Pierre Gasly has looked very good. Yuki Tsunoda, as we said. Tsunoda, I think, has been the real star of testing for me. What he did on that final day, I think, was really impressive to see. He looks like he settled in well at that team. So I think it's going to be a good season for Alpha-Tauri again. Do I think they could potentially break into the top 6? I think they could. I'm not entirely sure what we think about. I'm not entirely sure how big Ferrari's improvement will be. Aston Martin and Alpine from testing haven't looked the most convincing. So I reckon Alpha-Tauri could do it. And I think perhaps if we see another podium from them this year, wouldn't surprise me at all.
Oh, sorry, there we go. Yes. It is one of those teams where the ceiling, I'm not really sure what the ceiling is because we've seen them go exceed the ceiling. So it's now, I suppose, sort of where can they go from here? But we've talked about Pierre Gasly. I did want to plug, he wrote a piece in the Players Tribune, a self-penned piece entitled You Want to Know the Real Pierre. And not that they're sponsoring me or anything to say this, but it is a really great read, a really great first-hand perspective from him. So I would recommend checking that out because there's he touches on a lot of emotional things as well to do with Anton Hubert's crash and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, very, very moving piece. Second place in our livery rankings, it's Alfa Romeo, who, again, Joe, you had this as your favorite car. I suppose you want to describe why?
It was my favourite livery last year as well, Alfa Romeo, which was kind of a hipster pick when we were doing our season review. They seem to have flipped an awful lot of the red and the white from last year, so it's actually low-key one of the bigger changes we've seen with liveries on the grid this year. I don't really know what there is to say about it. It's just, for me, it's really clean. They handle the multiple colours really well. I love the Alfa Romeo racing logo on the gearbox cover. That's just beautiful. They've balanced the red, or should I say maroon and white, really well. Yeah, I just think it's a very simple, clean, nice-looking car. And I'm really hoping that Raikkonen and Giovinazzi have a good package this year because that Ferrari power unit really let them down last year.
Yeah, again, I suppose we're getting to. It seems to me that all experimental designs finish bottom of these rankings, and all the ones that sort of remain somewhat consistent, albeit actually the team that finished number one in this, and people might realize who finished top of these rankings, they actually went for quite experimental design too, and it worked. But a lot of these teams went with sort of the tried and tested, which went very well. Alfa Romeo, interesting. I mean, sort of back of the mid-table. I guess, and maybe you guys can correct me. Tom can correct me as well. Alfa Romeo, I think, is sort of ahead of the Williams Haas tier, but at the back end of the Alpha-Tauri, Aston Martin, that kind of tier. So what are your general thoughts heading into, what are you expecting from this team? Because ideally we'd like them to, challenge the sort of the cluster of 3 or 4 teams in the mid-table. And yet, we might be disappointed on that front because they're sort of just in between. It's a bit of a weird one to predict and judge at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, for me, Alfa Romeo is a clear 8th in the championship. So they're better than Haas and Williams, but they're not quite at the level of the other teams, including Alpha-Tauri, which we've just touched upon. if I could briefly talk about delivery, I think delivery is also well done. I really like what they've done with the green clover, which is nice. The quadrifoglio, I think Alfa Romeo calls it. So I really like what they've done there. If I move back more to testing now, I feel like Alfa's testing was very promising, actually. They've got the most laps in with Alpha-Tauri, I believe. So showing that that Ferrari engine is quite reliable, hopefully, even though maybe not the quickest. Kimi did string quite a decent fast lap in the last day. Sadly, obviously, the team did say it was on really low fuel and it would with the softest C5 compound. So what we can really take out of testing for Alfa Romeo is their consistency, and I'm really hoping that both Kimi and Giovinazzi will be able to get some points here or there, and I think they can hope to sometimes get into Q2 and maybe challenge for those 9th, 10th positions sometimes, nothing more. But I do think the driver pairing is a good driver pairing on paper. Obviously, Giovinazzi has had his down moments, and Kimi is now 39 years old, or even maybe 40, I believe. So he is old. So it's the end of an era, I feel, for them. But I've got full confidence in Frédéric Vasseur, who's a team principal I hold in very high regard for what he does on a smaller budget. So it'll be interesting to see how Alfa Romeo do this year. And even though I don't think they'll be able to challenge with the likes of Alpha-Tauri and the others.
Yep, there we go. Again, the driver lineup, obviously they've kept some stability from last season. They kept the same pairing. Joe, I know you took a big interest in Giovinazzi last year and his progression. What are you expecting from him this season? Because again, we're not, because of the limitations of the car, we're not expecting him to, do a Pierre Gasly per se, make that sort of meteoric leap. But certainly he can, again, just work on his craft and put himself in a position where maybe Ferrari might turn to him at some point 3 years, 4 years down the line. So what are you thinking? What are your thoughts on him and his development going forward?
The funny thing is that we're expecting, perhaps wrongly, that Kimi Räikkönen, the most experienced Formula One driver in history, is going to retire at the end of the 2021 season, ahead of the new regs coming in for 2022, by which time Antonio Giovinazzi will have been in this team for so long that he will essentially be a Kimi Räikkönen figure, ultra experienced within the Alfa Romeo hierarchy for whoever it is that they promote from Ferrari's junior program ahead of 2022. Giovinazzi was someone who last year I said he was the most improved driver on the grid, and I was quite quietly annoyed at the amount of people at Raw Sport that said Gasly had improved more than him, because in my opinion Gasly was already one of the best. Giovinazzi last year went from a driver who I didn't think deserved to be on the grid, in all honesty, despite our compatriot links, to someone who for me was absolutely indispensable. He had a record last year which went almost the entire season, I think, of gaining at least one position on every opening lap of the year. His starts were fantastic, even relative to Räikkönen, who, especially at Portugal, had a barnstorming first lap in changeable conditions. But in addition to that, Giovinazzi's pace across the entire race was often very impressive as well. He was my runner-up for driver of the day at the Eiffel Grand Prix at the Nürburgring last year. He went from the absolute back of the grid to finish 10th in a car that really wasn't that impressive at that track. And he was soundly better than Räikkönen, whose sole contribution in the race was to punt George Russell off at turn 1. Giovinazzi has developed massively over the last couple of years in Formula One. He's come a long way from those crashes at the beginning of 2017 when he was sitting in for Pascal Wehrlein at Sauber. He's going to have a difficult year. He needs to justify his place on the grid again, simply because he's Italian Jesus and he's always going to have a little bit of doubt. But as a senior citizen, despite being at quite a young age at that team, I would love to see Giovinazzi on the grid again, whoever his teammate is the following year.
Oh, there we go. Let's bring Cam Hall into this. Again, to go off your point, I think Giovinazzi sort of got lost out with so many young drivers sort of breaking out last season. He's sort of forgotten about, and even in the car that's doing better than George Russell's at Williams, he sort of still ends up not quite the right. He doesn't get that. He doesn't have the profile of fandom just yet. Did you want to weigh in, Joe, or something?
Before we go on to Cam, the absolute best moment to describe how overlooked Giovinazzi was when I'd nominated him for most improved driver, and you introduced him as being a Haas driver for last season, which I find insulting. Just thought I'd remind you.
Yeah, you're right. You know what? Yes, I made that mistake. I can't take that back. It happened. Come at me, Giovinazzi fans, like Joe. I did want to turn to the other. Just a quick word on Kimi Räikkönen. His longevity is just it's amazing at this point. It's sort of like the staple of the sport at this point. Like it's almost as if when he does go, the sport will sort of feel incomplete. So just a quick word of just just on how he's just consistently been able to bring out some performances and could be some point scoring performances as well, because he has sort of flirted with those in the last few seasons or so.
Yeah, I don't think there's really much more I can say from what you said. Kimi Räikkönen has been one of the most consistent drivers on the grid. Last year was not his best year. Giovinazzi did outpace him last season. He was the better driver, particularly towards the end of the season. But yeah, Kimi has been a part of the furniture now in Formula One for the last couple of decades. I do feel this feels like the right time for Kimi to go. I feel you get to a stage in a driver's career where you get that time to walk away. If I feel he stays on at the end of this season, especially as Joe mentioned earlier, with the incredible talent that there is in the Ferrari driver academy at the moment, that would end up with one of those drivers in Alfa-Romeo. Really, there is an argument that he is holding a seat that Callum Ilott should be having this season. So I feel Kimi Räikkönen, he's achieved what he can in Formula One. It has been a career, obviously, delivering a world championship, will be the most races in Formula One by the end of the season. It's a career that he will be very proud of. And I think it's fair to say, come the end of the season, he does deserve one hell of a party.
Hang on. No, there I am. Jesus, one hell of a party, honestly.
Someone call Stuart Croft.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I no words on that one. I did want to say, and now I've lost my train of thought. No, I do have it. And I know, again, it's a can of worms. Maybe it's another topic for another show, debating the top 10 drivers ever of all time or in the 21st century or whatever. Kimi Räikkönen was on the maybe list for top 10. I don't know if he makes it, but certainly he's in the conversation that, he deserves to be mentioned as a possible person. I don't think beyond that he gets in, but just a testament to his excellent career. And yes, that is a can of worms that maybe we'll have to open for another future show. I don't know. There should be more fanfare with this, but StreamYard, I don't have all the effects on this. The number one ranked car design, and by no means the favorite for Raw Sport to win the championship. Just we like the car. It's our favorite car, looking car at least. Is Alpine, the newcomers. Well, I say newcomers again, coming off the Renault, obviously building off the Renault name. Alpine with the best looking car as adjudged by our panelists. Here it is in all its glory. Let's see, Tom, you had this. I think you're the only one of our remaining panelists who had this number one. Just talk us through it. What made it the number one choice?
Yeah, I really find it a stunning car. That satin blue just works so perfectly. And being a half French myself, I always like seeing the French flags on the car. I really do think it's really well done. The first livery, the black livery, was also a really nice one, but I do think this one is an improvement. I also like the black floor and the red matte fray. I do really think all the colours are in the correct proportions, and everything works on that car. If there's only one small downfall, which we'll get onto maybe later. It's how big the airbox is at the top. It is quite a large airbox, but as liveries go, it's for me certainly the best one on the 2021 grid.
Yeah, I'm trying to find an angle for that airbox, but I'm sort of limited by what photos I'm given. But this design, for full disclosure, this one was on everyone's top 3 at least. It never fell beyond third place. Cam, it's a strong. Again, it's sort of similar to the Aston Martin. It's a bold looking car for it's not the debut for this manufacturer, obviously, but obviously different name, a team with a different name, and sort of a new management. It's a bold look, and certainly, it's one that's going to turn heads, and certainly, find itself new fans as it has already.
Well, it certainly doesn't make me just keep thinking of the Caterham cars from the start of the decade. But yeah, bold, I think, is the word that I think probably best describes Alpine. It's a bold livery with a bold driver lineup and a really bold approach to team management as well this season. The national identity, obviously, we talked about the whole national identity with Haas earlier on, but you can tell this is a very French car. It's not just the French flags, but the use of the colours throughout. If someone told me that this was a French team, I would totally not be surprised by that at all. And I think this is very much, very bold statement from Alpine. I think just trying to really give themselves, move away from Renault as well, and kind of say this is a slightly new operation. I must say, I haven't actually seen any of the other Alpine cars before, so I don't know if this is kind of a sort of a trend that they have, but it is a very nice looking car. I had this third personally, but yeah, it's a very nice looking car. And as we said, it's bold to very much, I think, suit what the team is going for this year.
Yeah, and speaking of bold, people can see, we've been airlifting this from the Formula One website. There is a little headline on the right here that I am going to bring up. And granted, I'm not going to make everyone read it. I'll skim it off camera. I'll skim it quickly and sort of pull out the key quotes. But there's the headline, Joe. Welcome back, Fernando Alonso, is sort of my answer. That is some way to announce your return.
Yeah, an even more questionable announcement of his return than allowing Fernando Alonso, aged, I believe, 38, to take part in a young driver's test at the end of last year. Also given an awful lot of laps in testing. They really have done everything in their power to reacclimatise Alonso coming back for this year. It's a bold livery. I'm not going to talk about it much more. I think it came third for me. The lineup is very interesting as well. I have a controversial prediction, which I may go on to later in the show. I've got hope for it. The real story for me in this team is just how well Esteban Ocon performs this year. I remember when we did the review last year, Kate Mason of the Formula One Society nominated Esteban Ocon for Most Improved Driver of last year, which is a very fair nomination. His improvement from the beginning of last year, getting soundly beaten by Ricciardo, to a driver so aggressive and balanced that he was actually able to overtake at Yas Marina, which is something I can't do on the F1 game, let alone in real life. Really impressive. Ocon should not be discounted as a future of the Mercedes team either. Remember, he is still a Mercedes Academy contracted driver. Personally, foreshadowing what I'm going to say later, I don't see many ways that Fernando Alonso can do better than him this year if Ocon performs at his best.
I have found, and I'm going to share the screen, I did find a quote. So it comes from an interview with the BBC. You guys can read it. I'm not going to, but for the audio listeners, I will read it out because I've just realized this is going to be a podcast. So for the audio listeners, Alonso said to the BBC, "It's going to be great. I'm looking forward to it. There were some young, talented guys who have been showing great performances in the younger categories, and we still have the champions that were here 2 years ago, Lewis, Sebastian, and Kimi. Verstappen," and then he talks about Verstappen, and then when asked, is he as good as those drivers, those champions he sort of alluded to, he then went, "No, I'm better," and end quote there. So Fernando Alonso very confident. Obviously, I think the thing that strikes me with this, Tom, is that I don't think Fernando Alonso, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't feel like he would have risked his legacy to come back for, say, if Haas or Williams came calling. It has to be a project that he believed in. Obviously, he has history with Renault, who obviously now been rebranded as Alpine. This strikes me as someone who's sort of, while he has been obviously and has, he's always made no secret that he wanted to come back to Formula One. This seems like a project he believes in, and therefore, that in itself is exciting, because if he feels this will be able to help him compete with the big boys at the top, then yeah, that promises a lot of that promises and should promise a lot of excitement amongst fans.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can see it from when he left. He never wanted to say that it would be a farewell. It was only just a goodbye from him. And you could see he was always hungry for F1. And I think, yes, as you alluded to, he's got history. He's got 2 world championships with that Renault team, which is now Alpine. I think it will be a very interesting year for Alpine. And if Alonso believes in it, I think there's a good chance it might come to fruition. I'm just thinking it's going to be very hard this year. And after what's happened with McLaren Honda and him, for example, in Suzuka calling the Honda engine a GP2 engine, he's not the one to shy away from criticism. And so what I think for Alpine this year is that it's going to be a really hard year. Why? Because Cyril Abiteboul, sadly, for reasons I do not understand, left the team and has now been replaced by Davide Brivio, that Alpine has come to fetch from Suzuki in MotoGP. So that, for me, is already a sign that things might not be going too well for them in the first place. Certainly in the first races, it'll be a bit hard for them it'll be a bit hard for them, seeing as though they're under new management. Additionally, what can we take from the Bahrain test? Even Alonso himself said the car was a bit slow, and we could see it in the speed trap. I believe that the Renault engine was the slowest engine in Bahrain, and therefore I believe that with Fernando Alonso, I do still rate him very highly and still as one of the best drivers on the grid. I just feel like it's going to be a bit hard for them for him to consistently get the car into Q3, even though maybe for 2022, which I believe he'll stay for, I think Alpine is onto great things.
Cam, I know you had you wanted a word on, I guess, the new management taking on Alpine.
Yeah, so Brivio is an interesting one. I've just got an article up I've just found kind of talking about Brivio. And I said it last time that we were talking about him. And I said, if you look at Brivio's record at Suzuki in MotoGP, he had a record of doing a lot of really good work on development, both developing the team and linking the operations between perhaps the engine manufacturers and the production of the cars in the factories, as you had with MotoGP, where a lot of the work was split between Europe and Japan. Obviously, a lot of it is split between Enstone and the work that they do in the factory, I think just outside Paris in France. So he will do a lot of work there, but more importantly, there's a lot of work that he did in MotoGP in terms of development. And someone like Johan Mir, for example, who won the championship in 2020, really nurtured on by Brivio. And Brivio has taken a Suzuki team that really wasn't fancied a few years ago to the top. So there's clear that he has a record in motorsport of doing the kind of thing that I think Alpine want. Now, Alonso's an interesting part of this puzzle because he doesn't really fit in with that kind of long-term development idea that Brivio's kind of always used. So I don't know if Alonso's just a stopgap maybe for a Renault Academy driver, because if there's one thing you can say about the Renault Academy drivers, particularly in F2 last season, is that they were quite underwhelming. And certainly if you compare them to those that are being put forward by the Ferrari Academy, for example, Renault would have cause for concern. So I think Brivio serves a very much that developmental long-term planning role. I think the thing with Abiteboul is that as a team principal, I just don't think he was particularly liked. I don't think he was liked by many within the team. I don't think he was certainly not liked by many outside the team. And I don't think he handled the Daniel Ricciardo situation very well at all. So I think this is very much, Alpine trying to put a new start from the last 5 years as Renault, but putting in place someone who I think very much sees that long-term project. So I think David Brivio is certainly an advancement from Cyril Abiteboul. I think the dynamic he has with Alonso is going to be interesting. I think that could cause tension. I wouldn't be surprised if Alonso stays in it, goes on to top the grid. But at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if Alonso goes after 1 or 2 years because he doesn't fit in with what Brivio is looking for. But I think certainly for someone like Esteban Ocon, I really could see Brivio putting him as that person he wants to win the championship with. That person that he's looking like he did with Johan Mir. That person that 3 or 4 years down the line from when he comes in is going to be the spearhead of that team that's going to be taking him to world championships. So I think this is a very interesting long-term move from Alpine that I really do think has a lot of potential.
I will say about Cyril Abiteboul, he also can't be trusted because he didn't get his tattoo yet. So I'm waiting on that because that hasn't happened. So if he's a man of his word, he needs to get that tattoo. You know what I mean? Like we've Joe and Cam, you've been on the show when we talked about the tattoo bet, and he hasn't got it. So
that's why he's been sacked.
That's my complaint. Yeah.
Although I think he said on Drive to Survive he was getting a honey badger at least. So
okay,
but he said COVID, and I suppose I don't want to apportion any blame given COVID, but as soon as COVID's over, I don't think he holds much excuse.
I guess tattoo parlors aren't open during COVID. I can't say I'm aware of if they are or not, but okay, fair enough. Yeah, he'll get a pass from me for now. Yeah, so that will do it. I guess we've gone through all 10 teams. And done so within exceeding the 2 hours, but that's fine. I sort of expected us to go beyond it anyway. But let's talk in general some season predictions. Now, I wish Formula One was at the stage where I could go, guys, who do you think is going to win the championship? And, have a wide array of opinions and different teams. Unfortunately, I sort of know the answer, so I'm not going to ask that. So really, I'm limited to 3 questions or so that I think I'm going to get a varied lot of answers. So let's look at the we'll start with the calendar, which I'm just going to share screen again. Albeit I am going to scroll through it quite quickly. So for the audio listeners, I'll read them out. So we start with Bahrain. We then have Italy, Emilia Romagna, and I'm going to butcher these pronunciations as well as a full disclosure. Portimao's back. It comes back for round 3. Spain in round 4. And then Monaco in 5. So a lot of the races that are usually on the calendar have returned following the COVID affected year of 2020. Baku's back around 6. Then we head to Canada in early June. That is followed up by France. And then Austria to kick off July. And then obviously Silverstone around 10, I think around the halfway mark. And then there is a couple weeks before we go to Hungary, and then I think that's sort of the mid-season break. Yeah, 4 weeks, 3 weeks or so before we head to Belgium. Zandvoort for the first time, I think that was meant to happen last year obviously, but that didn't happen. So that's back, and then back to Italy we go. Round 15 to Joe's favorite track, Sochi. We're back.
How dare you?
I knew where that was going. Leaving Sochi behind, we're going to the original street circuit, the OG in Singapore. Or, well, actually, no, Monaco's the OG. Fine, the second OG of the modern ones, at least. Japan, round 17, that's still early October. Then we go back to the US, round 18. The end of October finishes in Mexico. Round 20, November, Brazil. Interlagos is thankfully still on the calendar. I don't think they're doing that street circuit in Sao Paulo anymore, or not Sao Paulo, whatever city it was. So that's good. Australia is round 21, which is really weird. It's a weird site, but obviously, understandably, they pushed it back. So at least we're getting it in November. We then go back to the Middle East and Jeddah for round 22, which I'm sure I'm going to ask the panelists what they think about the Jeddah circuit, and then we finish off in Abu Dhabi. So a pretty packed schedule. 23 races, pretty much back to the norm. Globe trotting as it is. So yeah, I mean, let's start with, we have a few new tracks. A lot of tracks obviously returning. Some thankfully also returning from last year's sort of European heavy schedule. Tom, let's start with you. What track are you looking forward to? What race are you looking forward to this season?
Yeah, I've always been a big fan of Monaco. I have always loved seeing cars at their absolute limit on those tight streets. And so I believe the Grand Prix will be end of May, and it was really missed last year on the calendar. And so I'm really buzzing to see it back this year. It's really interesting to see who comes out on top. Red Bull have been good at that track in recent years, so hopefully this may still continue. But I think it will be a close battle, and even though the racing on the Sunday is obviously not the closest, it's just worth it for the qualifying on the Saturday. So really looking forward to Monaco in particular.
Yeah, obviously Monaco is very much a staple. Obviously missed last year. Is back. Cam, I turn to you next. What track are you looking forward to this season?
I think I want to give a special mention firstly to Baku, because I really like the Baku track, even though it's kind of everything I normally say I don't like about tracks. Those are 90-degree corners, really weirdly tight sections. But I think that's really adds to the magic of the track, and I think the whole setting, and it's a really challenging track for the drivers as well, technically. So it's always a fun one to watch, and the racing's always a bit mad. And also, I'm pleased to see the return of Paul Ricard. It's always a good opportunity to catch up on some lost sleep. So good to have that back. But my main pick's Interlagos. I mean, it's a phenomenal track, Interlagos. And I really was sad that it may not have been that may have been dropped from the calendar entirely. I don't think I can recall a race at Interlagos that I haven't liked or I haven't found entertaining. As a track, you've got some incredible elevation changes throughout. The corners are a really good variety of kind of high-speed corners, low to medium-speed corners. It really does challenge the drivers. And as a circuit as well, in Brazil, a country that is in love with motorsport, a country where the atmosphere is always incredible, I'm hoping that COVID restrictions Brazil doesn't really have many COVID restrictions in the first place, but I'm hoping the COVID situation in Brazil has calmed down to the point where F1 will allow the fans to come back. And if they do, I mean, Mexico's always a party, but Brazil, and I'm sorry to say this again, will be one hell of a party.
That head of Raw News position has really gotten to you, hasn't it? Honestly. Yeah, fingers crossed that, fingers crossed all these circuits we get to. Obviously, we don't know. And certainly Brazil is certainly a country that has suffered a fair bit from COVID. So fingers crossed. But Joe, I turn to you. What track or race are you looking forward to?
3 above the rest. Imola, especially if it's called the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, not the San Marino Grand Prix. I know it's not an amazing racetrack, but to drive it, even in a simulator, it's absolutely incredible. I'm very happy that Baku is back as well, although not as much as Portimao, which I think should be on the calendar every single year. It was my favorite race of last year in terms of like the pure action of last year. With the exception of like the moment when Gasly won at Monza, I honestly enjoyed the Portimao race even more. But the track I'm most looking forward to going back to, I'm not going to argue why now, but for me, the best Formula One track in history. I am so happy that Suzuka is back on the calendar because that track is incredible.
Yeah, another one that unfortunately we didn't get to see in 2020. But again, very excited. Suzuka always produces some spectacular races, so that'll be one to look forward to. Quickly, we should allude to, we mentioned Jeddah. It is the newest track. And I say newest track, I mean newly created track, not necessarily a historic track we're returning to, just a newly created track altogether. It has caused a stir, it's fair to say, amongst fans. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but just a quick word from each of you, starting with Cam. and I say quick, I know Cam and Joe have plenty to say on this track. Your thoughts?
It's awful. I mean, it's a track now. I understand they want to do something a bit different. So let's make a street circuit and let's make it fast. Which, okay, I'll give them that. It's something different. But it really just doesn't inspire much confidence. Because if you look at the simulator laps that they showed, I couldn't see one spot, apart from maybe turn 1, where you've got that straight and you've got a bit of a braking zone there. I just can't see one point where you're going to have overtaking. If you look at the way the track's designed, so you'll go, yes, it's a fast track naturally, but it's not because it's fast because it's got loads of long straights into braking zones. It's just a sequence of long flowing corners. And then apart from turn 1, any time where you've got some sort of straight before it, it's a long flowing corner, at least medium speed. So it's just not a track that's going to encourage overtaking. I compared it. Me and Joe were talking, and I compared it to the final sector at Valencia, which was just a constant kind of medium to high speed corners where it's constant kind of left, right, flowing corners into a braking zone at the end. Except this, I'm not even really sure has the braking zone in it. So I can't see, particularly as this is a street circuit, it's tight as well. I just can't see there being any overtaking on this track. So if you get pole and you don't retire, you've pretty much got this race sewn up. And that is just disappointing.
Tom, new tracks have sort of been hit or miss, it's fair to say, over recent years. We have had hits. It's obviously subjective, but I would argue Singapore's been a hit. I would say, obviously, the return to historic tracks last year, all pretty much hits. Sochi, not so much. So there is the scale of Sochi to Singapore, I guess. Where do you put Jeddah? And what were your thoughts when you saw the design?
Yeah, I really don't like the track. Firstly, we shouldn't be racing in Saudi Arabia to start off with. That's already scandalous to start off with. And I know it's because of the Aramco sponsorship that F1 has, but racing in Saudi Arabia should never be the case. But if we focus solely on the track, as Cam said, you're missing the braking zone. The only braking zone you have is turn 1, and they've put a chicane there. And chicanes, as we know, aren't the best for overtakes. So I really see no overtaking on that track. I would even say it's probably a worse track than Sochi, because at least at Sochi we find overtakes. And so street circuits can be good, and I like the concept of a fast street circuit, but with these cars in mind, following will be impossible. Hopefully in 2022 though, and that's what F1 has promised, the new cars will be able to follow more closely, and so hopefully that will provide better racing. But for the race in 2021, I'm already predicting a Hamilton pole and he walks away with it. So yes, as terrible as Sochi in my view.
Joe, I give you the final word on this. It's great to have a much-loved track at the back end of the season when points are on the line, standings are on the line, and we have a race where it could be decided by qualifying. What a great race to have at the back end of the season.
Yeah, people seem to think a fast street circuit is a novelty, clearly because they haven't heard the words Albert Park in the 23 years it's been on the calendar. No, more than that now. I'll try to keep it as concise as possible, but I worry this is going to be another rant, Josh. It's very telling of the current climate in Formula One and reliant on the Aramco backing that the Saudi Arabia track in the desert isn't complete yet. So rather than waiting a year for a Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, we have a temporary street circuit, which looks like a blueprint for how not to create an overtaking track in Formula One. I completely agree with Thomas. We should not be racing in Saudi Arabia, partly because of their record on human rights, but also because the Formula E race in Diriyah was targeted by a missile strike from Yemeni rebels in the last few weeks, which is a story that's not gotten the attention it deserves. I'm worried about the driver's safety, let alone the safety of citizens in Saudi Arabia itself, although fittingly the track is anti-clockwise, so it has about as many rights as Saudi Arabia itself. If you just focus on the transition between sectors 2 and 3, the amount of really fast left-right kinks, that is the bit on the track that angers me the most. Sector 1, at least from a driving experience with the tight proximity of the walls, very difficult positioning. As a driving track, that's not so bad. But the problem with those incredibly fast left-right sweeps is that unlike a straight line, where by definition you don't, whether you're left or right, you reach the end point at the same, that you have to follow going through those corners. And the downforce requirements are so high that there is absolutely no chance of overtaking. I watched the simulator lap just like Cam did, and I watched it with my little brother Jack. We both do an awful lot of work in simulators, and we went through a laundry list of categories that we drive in. So my passion for DTM, his GT cars, prototypes, modern Formula One, even touring cars of like British Touring Championship level. We cannot spot a single place on that track where an overtake is possible or indeed easy in any of those categories. A lot of tracks in Formula One are regarded as boring because they're hard to overtake in a Formula One car. Paul Ricard, Barcelona, they're not bad tracks. They just don't suit the incredibly high aero requirements of modern Formula One. I can't think of a single category, top flight or junior, where an overtake is easy on this track. I hate it. It might even be worse than Sochi, at least on paper. At least at Sochi, I can see where Herman Tilke thought cars would be able to overtake. Not so much here.
Wow, that is. I mean, you've said it might be worse than Sochi. From coming from you, that's quite a jump there. Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know if F1 like getting customer feedback, but Stefano Domenicali, I guess that, and to be honest, your views sort of summarize the collective fan base of Formula One as well. It's not out there take, for those who maybe are listening for the first time, it's not an out there take. Like, you Google it and similar opinions are coming out. So interesting stuff. I pity the head of sport who will have to drum up excitement and encouragement for this one. I won't be there. So that's, great. Something to look forward to, I guess, if you're running head of sport. For running for the Raw head of sport. But anyway, some other predictions I did want to ask, again, as I sort of made light of, I can't really ask who's going to win the title, drivers or teams, who's going to finish bottom, because we all sort of have the answer. So the two I have come up with, first of all, most improved team, or I guess maybe team. When I say most improved team, it's sort of the question of which mid-table team is going to finish out on top. I sort of feel like that's what that question implies, just because I don't know if Haas or Williams are going to improve their standing per se. Maybe Alfa-Romeo might be put in that category as well. So let's start with Cam. Of the mid-table teams, we're thinking, Ferrari are in mid-table, McLaren, Aston Martin, Alpine, Alpha-Tauri, I guess. Those are the five. Correct me if there's any other ones, but I think those are the core five per se. Which one do you think will have the edge over the rest?
I'll say this. I think McLaren will come third in the constructors. So they'll be top of that group. But I think in terms of teams taking a step forward, I think it is going to be Alpha-Tauri who take the biggest step forward. I could easily see, based on what we've seen at testing and based upon, I think, both the way that, as we mentioned earlier, that Gasly has come on so much recently, that he has really shaped himself as a leader at that team. He's someone who can get those consistent points finishes. And with Tsunoda looking quick as well, I could easily see them coming fourth or fifth. And considering that Alpha-Tauri have kind of been at the lower end, I guess, kind of towards the end of that sort of midfield group, if they can get themselves in the top half, I really do think that this is going to be a real achievement for them. So yes, Alpha-Tauri for me, even though they won't top that five, are for me the team that's going to be the most improved.
Tom, same question. We can take McLaren maybe out of the equation because I think we feel that they're going to be the ranked team. So maybe take that one out. But obviously 4 to 7th is sort of up for grabs. So what are your thoughts on that battle that we anticipate is going to happen?
Yeah, so I personally think fourth, I don't know whether it's me hoping, but I believe fourth will go to Ferrari. I think Ferrari is the team that needs to improve the most. That's all the other teams, we want them to improve, but Ferrari really needs to improve because last season was just unacceptable for them, as we've previously said. And I think that Alpha-Tauri, though, had the highest potential to surprise everyone. They already surprised everyone, as Cam said. during pre-season testing, and I think they'll continue doing it throughout the season. Maybe a couple of high points finishes. I don't expect another win such as like Gasly at Monza last year, but I still think I second everything of what Cam said, and I do think Alpha-Tauri will be the most improved team going into 2021.
Yeah, I mean, again, this sort of opens. I mean, again, this is one of the questions that sort of opens up different options. I'm sure the Aston Martin fans who think that Sebastian Vettel might add something, and certainly they'll be able to make some strides. Obviously, the cars haven't changed too much from last season, so they have a bit of an advantage there. And similarly, I guess as same with the teams you guys have mentioned as well. So it's going to be interesting. Same question with drivers, really, because obviously, again, we expect Hamilton. Some might have I've sort of asked before, Bottas, Verstappen, who would be second. You guys sort of answered that. Perez, we think is going to be fourth, and then if say we have Ricciardo and Norris fifth or sixth, then it sort of opens up the rest of the drivers being sort of on an even keel per se. So, Cam, I'll open with you again. If there's a driver that's going to make some big strides this season, like we saw Gasly last season, like we've seen with Carlos Sainz maybe a few years back beforehand, and Sergio Perez, who is that driver that you've got your eye on, that is you expect that is going to make some big strides this year?
Do you know what this is? I was thinking about it. This is a tougher question, I think, than it looks on paper, because a lot of the drivers that you kind of say that you would be looking on a list, the likes of your Lando Norris's, your Carlos Sainz's, Pierre Gasly's, a lot of them moved on a lot in 2020. So the kind of pool you can draw from is not really big. So I'd say there's two drivers here I think I'm keeping my eye on. Or actually, I'll say George Russell just very quickly, because obviously what we saw from him in 2020 and at the end of it, I think there's an expectation he needs to show some improvement just to solidify his claim to that Mercedes seat. But there's two drivers I'm looking out for. Firstly, Antonio Giovinazzi. Joe has talked a lot about how much he came on last year. If he is someone who Ferrari are going to turn to in the future, if he is someone who's going to justify a lot of the hype that there is around it, that has been built up, or at least certainly not the most public hype, but certainly among members of the F1 community, a lot more, I think, affection and a lot more support for Giovinazzi. I think he needs to back it up this season. He doesn't want 2020 to just kind of look like it was the season where he peaked and then he fell again. I do think he can do that, and I think he has made a lot of strides last year, and I think if he can follow that up, I think if he can resoundingly beat Kimi Räikkönen, if he can get, again, those more consistent points finishes, Giovinazzi at least puts himself in a situation where other teams will come looking for him, because I think that's the thing that's going to count for Giovinazzi. He needs to have other teams that could look out for him. So it kind of puts Alfa Romeo in a position where, like, well, we kind of feel like we need to keep you now. And it keeps Ferrari interested as well, because if other teams are looking out for him, then they know that they've got someone on their hands who they do need to look at potentially promoting. So that's the first point on Giovinazzi. Secondly, Esteban Ocon. As I touched on when we talked about David Brivio, if Mercedes don't come for Esteban Ocon, which if Lewis Hamilton retires at the end of the season, or whatever, if Lewis or Bottas goes, we expect George Russell to be in the Mercedes in 22. If both drivers leave Mercedes, Esteban Ocon's not a shoo-in for that second seat. I've mentioned drivers like Carlos Sainz. Pierre Gasly, I easily reckon, could get in that seat if he doesn't want to do another season at Alpha-Tauri. So Esteban Ocon, if he doesn't go back to Mercedes, will be the driver that will be convinced, I think, by David Brivio wanting to build the team around him. But that requires, I think, him really stepping up. And we saw throughout 2020, a lot of the promise that Ocon had shown in his first stint when he was at Manor and then at Force India, he really started to show that much more aggressive driving style that we have seen from him in his early days, but one that was wielding results. And of course, getting on the podium in Sakir at the end of last season, I think restored a lot of people's interest in him. He needs to back that up with more consistent, high-scoring points finishes, the sort of things that Ricciardo was doing and the sort of things that people expect from Alonso. If he can do that, then I think he really, not only does he show a massive improvement, but he justifies himself as a potential future of that Alpine program if Mercedes don't come back for him, which is by no means a guarantee.
Yeah, Giovinazzi, Ocon, two good shouts for that sort of category, I suppose. Tom, your thoughts? I mean, is there a driver that, I guess, away from the front of the grid, you've got your eyes on to make a few strides this season?
Yeah, so a bit like Cam, two drivers, including Esteban Ocon. I mean, Cam's talked about it, but I mean, it was two very interesting seasons as with Daniel Ricciardo as teammate. Ricciardo did beat him in both seasons, but obviously Daniel Ricciardo is regarded as one of the best drivers on the grid, so it was always going to be hard. It'll be interesting to see how he does against the two-time world champion in Fernando Alonso, because after seeing what Alonso did to teammates such as Van Dorn, Ocon might be a bit worried. But no, honestly, I think Ocon has a point to prove, and if he showed that he can beat Alonso, he's in a good shape for the rest of his F1 career. Another driver I'm also looking at is Sebastian Vettel. He had a terrible season, worst season of his career at Ferrari last year. He needs to bounce back. People are starting to discard him. People are saying, oh, maybe he was after Red Bull all went downhill. And obviously he didn't get that title he much wanted with the Prancing Horse. But I still believe Vettel is one of the top drivers on the grid, and on his day, he's pretty much unbeatable. So I think Vettel also has a point to prove. And a lot of people were annoyed about how Perez seemed to have been let go very late in the season, and how he deserved that F1 spot, that Aston Martin spot. But if Vettel does show consistently that he's getting a good amount of points, I even think he could get a podium, then that would redeem his terrible season last year.
Yeah, again, some good shouts there. Joe, will bring you in the conversation. I know you have five. You've labeled it as 5 quick predictions. Now, I have no idea what the predictions are. I'm slightly nervous. I don't really know what you're gonna say. Which, for you, I mean, you're a bit of a loose cannon with your words. So here I go. Take the floor away, and I'll brace myself.
How dare you? The idea of these is that they are 5 predictions that history, logic, etc., dictates that none of these realistically should happen. If none of these happen, it will not be a surprise at all. However, in my warped multilingual mind, I think there is a possibility. If I get one of these right, I've done very well. Genuinely, this isn't like Hamilton winning the Drivers' Championship. These are absolutely out there. However, I think there is a precedent or a logic to all of them. Number 1, every team will score World Championship points in Formula 1 this year. Number 2, Esteban Ocon will score at least 1.5 times the points of his teammate Fernando Alonso for Alpine. Number 3, Nikita Mazepin will score points for Haas at least one of the following: Barcelona, Zandvoort, Hungaroring. Number 4, Daniel Ricciardo will out-qualify Lando Norris at a rate of at least 2-1 this year. And finally, for 2022, Mercedes, one of their drivers, will be Valtteri Bottas. There.
I might just have to clip that out. I mean, wow.
Yeah. If I'm wrong, come at me. I hold my hands up. I'm an easy target. If I get this wrong, it started here.
I don't think any of them are egregious enough for anyone to come after you. I don't think any of them are like rage-inducing. At least to me, they aren't. But eyebrow-raising, I'll say that. They are eyebrow-raising. But yeah, thank you all for your predictions on drivers, teams, and whatever Joe chucked in. Results, I suppose. Let's wrap. We should wrap this up soon, but I did want to bring up the Bahrain circuit. Let's just talk a little bit about the race coming out on Sunday. Obviously, testing has taken place in Bahrain, so drivers, there's usually practice section to acclimatize themselves. They've had a week or two to acclimatize themselves. So that's not an issue this time around. Cam, what are you looking forward to? Because Bahrain last year, obviously we had 2 races in Bahrain. Both lived up to, I mean, both were just very good. They were very exciting. Obviously, unfortunately, the one that we're talking about, the first one, and the one that I guess the track is being used, will be remembered for the horrific Romain Grosjean crash. But that aside, it was still a pretty entertaining race. So fingers crossed, hopefully we get something again like this.
This, within the current formula of cars, is one of the best tracks, I think, for it. I think there's that mixture of corners, a lot of braking zones where it encourages overtaking. There's not too many corners where there's a premium on following other cars. I'd say the only exception to that is probably turns 11, 12 through to 13. But the need to follow other cars compared to a track like Catalonia, where we normally do testing, is not really that much of a premium here. So this is one of Herman Tilke's better tracks. Definitely, I think you always get some racing here. First race of the season is always an interesting one because drivers tend to be a bit more tentative. They tend to be a bit more cautious. Yes, the reliability is not always the best in this race. So I do think, again, if we are being boring, I don't know, are we doing driver top 3s yet?
I was going to ask that. So feel free to, drop that in.
I will say, I think Mercedes have been sandbagging throughout testing. But so I am going to say, if you were doing the cars in terms of how you imagine they should be on a weekend, I would say Hamilton, Verstappen, Perez. But I would not rule out a sneaky Daniel Ricciardo podium depending on how reliability goes throughout this weekend.
Interesting. So I was going to ask for maybe a driver or a team. I mean, who was going to have a good weekend, essentially? So you think McLaren might have a good weekend?
Yeah, the cars look good throughout testing. It's looked the 3rd best car. The Mercedes engine does bring more reliability than the Renault engine. So I think they're going to have a good weekend. I think Alpha-Tauri, I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I'm going to say both cars I think will get into Q3. I think both cars will score good points. If reliability is that bad throughout the weekend, I wouldn't be surprised if Pierre Gasly finds himself on the podium by the end of the weekend. But I think on a normal weekend, I would say Hamilton, Verstappen, Perez on the podium, although Daniel Ricciardo if one of them retires.
Fair enough. Tom, I turn to you. What are your thoughts heading into this race specifically?
Yeah, I mean, the first race is always an interesting one because we don't really know where teams will find themselves. Obviously, we've got some suspicions with testing, but it's always great to see F1 cars back at their best during a race weekend. As for my predictions, I actually believe that Red Bull will hit the ground running, and therefore I'm predicting Verstappen win. And seeing as though Bottas always does well at the start of the season, I'm saying Verstappen, then Bottas and Hamilton. It may be completely wrong, but that's my predictions. Perez obviously won on the Sakir version of that circuit last year, but I don't think he'll be able to produce the same goods as he did last year. But yes, I'm just really looking forward to F1 again. Obviously now practice, I think it's important to note that all practice sessions are now 60 minutes, so an hour, instead of 90, 60, I believe, beforehand. So all teams will have an hour cut on their practice session. So that'll be also interesting if any teams are struggling on the Friday. And so, yeah, final note is I'm really looking forward to it. And I really think that Red Bull stand a good chance on this track.
Interesting stuff. I think, again, the marketing, putting Drive to Survive down like the weekend before the season starts, I think it's a stroke of genius. I think the excitement's palpable. Joe, your thoughts on this weekend?
I've already talked in the past about how much I love this track. In my very short career of league racing in Formula One simulations, this is the track where I got my one and only win against a bunch of Italians, which is one of my top 5 yeah boy moments of the last 5 years. Predictions for the weekend: Valtteri Bottas to win, Verstappen second, Lewis Hamilton third, The ballsy prediction, in light of how well he qualified at Sakir last year and the improvements to the Ferrari power unit, Charles Leclerc against the odds will make Q3. But I'm really looking forward to this weekend because Bahrain is great, ignoring political things.
I think it's everyone's favorite Middle Eastern track, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's the one that's
Not
sort of...
much of a competition.
Baku's good. Baku's good.
That's true, to be fair.
That's not Middle East, but yeah, sure.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Maybe not. Okay. So not Baku.
It's all right. We're 3 hours in. Brains can be warped at this point. I'll allow it. Yeah. I mean, I'm fascinated that all three of you put down 3 different winners of the race. I wasn't expecting that. So that should keep the neutrals or the casual fans entertained to see how that sort of shapes out. But that pretty much does it for us. I don't really feel like, does anyone have any closing thoughts or anything like that? Joe, is there anything you want to say?
Honestly, I'm just really glad Formula One is back and it's starting early. Also, I mean, we haven't talked about it today because it's an F1 preview, but Formula 2 and Formula 3 should be very interesting this year as well. Not going to go into more of it. But yeah, hopefully soon on my socials, you'll discover which driver/drivers in the paddock that I absolutely despise. And they're not Formula One drivers.
Oh boy!
I can't wait for the weekly Dan Tickton rants to return. I'm looking forward to them.
It's not Dan Tickton, believe it or not.
Oh, I'm now intrigued. I've got to say, I realised I actually completely forgot Valtteri Bottas in my predictions, but I just feel for me that's how this season's going to go for him. I feel Bottas, he's kind of had these 2 relaunches. I don't know how many times in himself he can relaunch himself and then come back and somehow expect that he's going to win the championship. I just feel we've reached the end of Bottas' time. That's not to say he's done bad at Mercedes, but I do think this season is going to be his last, and I think it's going to be a very evident last for Bottas.
Well covered, Cam. I will say, though, you did forget Mercedes driver, which is... given their status in the sport, that's not unforgivable.
It's been nearly 3 hours.
No, to be fair, it's not as bad as saying Giovinazzi's from Haas. So you know what, you get a pass. You get a pass on that one. I'm very excited, like everyone else. I don't know what we're gonna do. Because obviously we don't really have plans to do much programming during Easter. But maybe if something earth-shattering happens, maybe we'll have to do a bonus reaction show. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But anyway, I want to thank everyone who's joined me for the last nearly 3 hours or so. Cam Hall, Tom from F1 Sock. So check out F1 Sock once again. Joe Spagnoli as always. Luke James, who was on briefly as well. So yeah, we'll be back. Obviously, join the F1 Fantasy League. It'll be in the description down below. Please join it. Just so that I have more people, making it a competitive one, and so that Scuderia Spagnoli isn't the top team in the league, because I dare say I don't want that to happen. But thank you for watching. I will be putting timestamps in because I realize people won't want to watch the whole 3 hours. I will put timestamps in so people can find their favorite teams or so. So be on the lookout for that. But enjoy the first race, the first F1 weekend, and we will be back at some point soon. So thank you so much for watching or listening, and have a good weekend.